Hi angels. This is Healing at Home by the Angel Demon on AO3. Summary. Initially resistant to their care, Bakugou struggles with old habits and the need to prove his worth. But through shared challenges, heartfelt conversations, and moments of laughter, he begins to trust his new guardians and himself. With Aizawa's quiet guidance and Yamada's infectious optimism, Bakugou learns that strength isn't about isolation, it's about balance, resilience, and the courage to embrace vulnerability. As he sets new goals and lets go of past insecurities, he discovers a profound sense of belonging, knowing he's finally found a family who loves him just as he is. Chapter 1. The UA faculty lounge was dim and quiet, the clock ticking softly in the background as Aizawa reviewed his students' latest training scores. It was late, and most of the faculty had already gone home, but he preferred these quiet hours. It gave him the chance to think, to analyze each of his students, and consider where they needed guidance. One name stood out on his list, as it often did, Bakugou Katsuki. Aizawa leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he thought back on Bakugou's recent performance. The boy was undeniably powerful and ambitious, a standout in terms of raw talent. But something had shifted in his behavior over the past few months. Bakugou had always been intense, but lately, he seemed to be teetering on the edge of recklessness. His usual drive had taken on an almost desperate edge, pushing him to train harder and longer than anyone else, as if he were trying to outrun something. In recent training sessions, Bakugou's anger had flared up unexpectedly. It wasn't the usual competitive fire that Aizawa was used to seeing, it was more volatile, barely contained, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. He remembered one specific session where Bakugou had refused to stop, even after his hands were bloodied from repeated blasts. It was as if he couldn't bear to pause, as if rest itself was something he needed to avoid. Aizawa's gaze darkened as he recalled the incident. He'd stepped in, ordering Bakugou to stop and get medical attention, and the boy had scowled, his eyes flashing with something akin to resentment. But beneath that resentment, Aizawa had seen something else, something that looked suspiciously like hurt. It wasn't unusual for students to carry burdens that they tried to hide, especially when it came to family issues. Aizawa had been an educator long enough to recognize the signs. Sometimes, a student's drive to succeed wasn't fueled by ambition alone but by something darker, a need to prove themselves, to escape or mask the turmoil at home. He had seen it before in other students, though rarely as intensely as with Bakugou. Aizawa frowned, drumming his fingers on the desk. Bakugou was the kind of student who avoided vulnerability at all costs, deflecting any questions that veered too close to his personal life. The few times Aizawa had tried to ask him about family or his life outside of school, Bakugou had shrugged it off or redirected the conversation. Most students would mention family events or make casual references to their parents, but Bakugou was silent on the subject. It was subtle, but for Aizawa, it was enough to raise a flag. The silence was broken as Present Mike, Hizashi, his husband and colleague, entered the lounge, his usual bright demeanor toned down in respect for the late hour. He grinned at Aizawa, but the look in his eyes was curious. "Yo, Eraser. Burning the midnight oil again?" Hizashi took a seat across from him, his voice warm but quiet. Aizawa glanced at him, pushing Bakugou's file to the side. "Thanks for staying late. I wanted to talk to you about something. One of my students." "Bakugou." Hizashi's expression softened, and he nodded. "Bakugou, huh? I've noticed he's been a bit, well, intense lately. And that's saying something for him." Aizawa leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "It's more than just intensity. He's been pushing himself harder, almost to the point of self-destruction. His training has become reckless, and there's an edge to him that wasn't there before. I suspect there's something happening outside of school, something that he's not sharing." Hizashi nodded, his brow furrowing as he considered Aizawa's words. "You think it's a home situation?" "It's possible," Aizawa replied, his voice low. "He's always avoided talking about his family, and that's not unusual in itself, but combined with his recent behavior. I'm concerned. Kids don't act like that unless they're carrying something heavy, something they don't know how to handle on their own. Hisashi was silent for a moment, his usually cheerful expression tinged with sadness. He reminds me a bit of a student we had years ago, different situation, of course, but that same need to prove something, to push themselves to the breaking point. And if it's anything like that, he probably won't open up unless someone makes it clear they care. Aizawa nodded slowly, his gaze steady. I was thinking about offering him a place to stay. Just temporarily, at first, to give him a sense of stability. I don't think he'll accept easily, but if we approach it right, he might understand it's an option. Hisashi's face brightened, a hopeful smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You're serious? I think that's a great idea. I mean, Bakugou's a tough kid, but he's still a kid. He might act like he doesn't need anyone, but I think he needs this. And if he does accept, even a little stability could make a big difference for him. Aizawa allowed himself a small smile. If we do this, it has to be on his terms. He'll resist, probably reject the offer at first. But if he realizes we're serious, that we're here without judgment or pressure, he might start to open up. Hisashi chuckled, his voice softening. And I'll go all out. If Bakugou steps through our door, he'll be family. Whatever he needs, we'll be there. Aizawa looked at his husband, a trace of gratitude in his gaze. I know. And that's exactly why I want to do this. As the night wore on, they continued to talk, laying out their plan with careful thought and compassion. Bakugou was a student who guarded his emotions fiercely, but Aizawa knew that underneath that armor was someone who deserved understanding, support, and a chance at a real family. For now, they'd offer him a choice. And with any luck, Bakugou would find his way to them on his own terms. The following day, Aizawa waited at the back of the training room as Class 1A finished their afternoon exercises. He watched each student closely, his gaze lingering on Bakugou, who moved through the drills with his usual intensity, his expression set in a scowl. There was something undeniably fierce about the way Bakugou fought, as if he could conquer anything in his path through sheer willpower alone. But Aizawa noticed the weariness behind his forceful movements. Bakugou's shoulders sagged slightly, and his eyes had a tired edge, hinting at nights spent restless or perhaps lying awake in frustration. Aizawa's expression softened. He knew better than anyone how much Bakugou prided himself on his strength, but he also knew that everyone, no matter how strong, needed someone to lean on. As the students filed out, Aizawa called out in his usual quiet tone, Bakugou, a word. Bakugou stiffened, casting a suspicious glance over his shoulder. He looked as though he were expecting some form of reprimand, though he couldn't quite hide the curiosity in his expression. With a reluctant nod, he waited as the last of his classmates exited the room, then turned back to face Aizawa, his arms crossed. Yeah, sensei? Bakugou's tone was cautious, his guard already up. Walk with me, Aizawa said simply, his expression neutral. He kept his voice steady, avoiding anything that might trigger Bakugou's defenses. Aizawa knew that direct confrontation wasn't the way to approach him, not with something as sensitive as this. Bakugou followed him out of the training room and down the hallway. The silence stretched between them as they walked, Bakugou's eyes darting around as if trying to anticipate where they were headed. Eventually, they reached Aizawa's office, a modest room lined with stacks of files, a few spare uniforms, and training equipment. Aizawa gestured for Bakugou to sit, then closed the door quietly behind them. Bakugou settled into the chair reluctantly, his arms still crossed as he fixed Aizawa with a challenging stare. Aizawa took his own seat, meeting Bakugou's gaze without hesitation. Bakugou, Aizawa began, his tone calm, I wanted to talk to you because I've noticed a change in your behavior recently. Bakugou's frown deepened, and he immediately looked away. If this is about training, I'm doing everything you ask. I don't see what the problem is. Aizawa raised a hand slightly, signaling for him to pause. It's not about your performance. You're an excellent student, and your drive is unmatched. But lately, you've been pushing yourself to the edge. I'm concerned that this isn't just about training. Bakugou shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as he glanced down at his hands. Aizawa could see the faint scars on his knuckles, reminders of his relentless practice, the explosions that he summoned over and over without rest. The boy's entire body seemed wound-tight, like a spring ready to snap. You don't need to worry about me, Bakugou muttered, his voice low but defiant. I know what I'm doing. Aizawa remained unfazed. I know you do. But even the best heroes have limits. And sometimes, it's not about knowing what you're doing. It's about knowing when to step back. Bakugou's glare softened slightly, though he kept his arms firmly crossed. He seemed torn, as if he wanted to argue, but didn't quite have the words. Look, Aizawa continued, choosing his words carefully, I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to give you an option. If things outside of training are getting overwhelming, if you're ever in a situation where you need a place to stay, Yamada and I are here. No pressure, no obligation. Just an option. Bakugou's reaction was immediate, a defensive scoff, his eyes narrowing as if he'd just been insulted. What makes you think I need something like that? He asked, his voice laced with defiance and barely concealed anger. I'm not some kid who needs babysitting. Aizawa met his gaze calmly, letting Bakugou's words hang in the air, before replying. I'm not offering to babysit you, Bakugou. I'm offering you a place where you can be yourself without constantly proving anything. Somewhere you don't have to be on guard all the time. Bakugou's eyes flashed with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. I'm fine on my own, he muttered, his voice quieter, but no less tense. Aizawa noted the vulnerability beneath the defensiveness, a hint of doubt that Bakugou was clearly fighting to keep hidden. I know you are. But having support doesn't mean you're weak. Every hero, no matter how strong, has people they can trust. You don't have to carry everything alone. Bakugou shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. The anger seemed to drain from his expression, leaving something more fragile beneath, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even pain. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by his usual hardened look. Why would you even offer something like that? Bakugou asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not like I'm some charity case. Aizawa softened his gaze, his voice gentle. I'm offering because I believe you deserve a choice. A safe place, if you ever want it. You don't have to be anyone's case for that. Bakugou clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he seemed to grapple with Aizawa's words. He didn't respond right away, and Aizawa didn't push him. He knew this was something that Bakugou needed time to process. This was an invitation, nothing more. Finally, Bakugou looked up, his expression unreadable, but his tone slightly softer. I'll think about it. Aizawa nodded, satisfied with that response. That's all I ask. Take your time. The offer is open, whenever you're ready. Bakugou rose from his seat, his movements stiff and controlled. He glanced at Aizawa once more, as if searching for some hidden motive or agenda, but Aizawa's expression remained calm, unyielding. Without another word, Bakugou turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as he walked away. As Aizawa watched him go, he felt a faint glimmer of hope. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a rejection, either. Bakugou had heard him, and that was more than enough for now. Aizawa let out a quiet sigh, running a hand over his face as he leaned back in his chair. The conversation with Bakugou had gone as well as he could have hoped, better, even. He knew that for someone like Bakugou, any indication of openness was significant. It wasn't a commitment, but Bakugou's willingness to think about it was more than he'd expected. He glanced at the clock, realizing the evening was moving on. With the school halls now silent, he rose from his seat, grabbing his coat and heading home. Yamada would be waiting for him, and he knew his husband would be eager to hear how it had gone. As he stepped outside, the air was cool and crisp, the streetlights casting a soft glow over the quiet campus. Aizawa's mind drifted back to Bakugou's expression, the brief flash of vulnerability he'd seen, quickly hidden behind defensiveness. It was clear that Bakugou was uncomfortable with the idea of leaning on anyone, even a little. Aizawa understood that kind of pride. He had seen it in himself once, back when he was still adjusting to the idea of relying on others. But he also knew that it was possible to overcome it. He had learned, through time and trust, that letting people in didn't mean sacrificing strength. It was a lesson he was willing to help Bakugou learn, if the boy was ready. By the time Aizawa reached his apartment, he was greeted by the warm light spilling from the windows. Yamada was already in the kitchen, stirring something in a pot and humming quietly to himself. The smell of spices filled the air, a comforting scent that made Aizawa realize how much he had missed this sense of peace and familiarity. "Shoyuta," Yamada called with a grin as Aizawa stepped in. "You're back. So, how did it go?" Aizawa shrugged off his coat, hanging it up as he walked over to join Yamada. "It went about as well as I expected," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "He didn't say yes, but he didn't turn me down, either. He's considering it." Yamada's face lit up with excitement, and he clapped his hands together. "That's a good sign. For Bakugou, that's basically like saying he's halfway there." Aizawa couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at his lips. "I suppose so. But we'll need to be patient. If he does decide to stay with us, he's going to need time to adjust." Yamada nodded, his eyes softening. "Of course. We don't want him to feel like he's stepping into another place with tons of rules and expectations. I want him to know that he can just be himself here." Aizawa crossed his arms, leaning against the counter as he considered their next steps. "We'll have to keep things simple at first. Bakugou's not the type to respond well to sudden changes. We'll give him his own space, let him settle in, and slowly introduce some routines. I don't want him feeling like we're hovering over him." Yamada stirred the pot, nodding thoughtfully. "That makes sense. And hey, maybe we can find ways to make him feel comfortable without pushing too much. Like family dinners, he might grumble, but he'll get used to it eventually." Aizawa's gaze softened. He could already picture it, Bakugou sitting at their table, reluctantly engaging in conversation, likely complaining about Yamada's enthusiastic storytelling or the music playing in the background. But, in time, those little moments could start to feel like home. "He might not show it, but I think he wants this," Aizawa said quietly, almost to himself. "I think he wants a place where he doesn't have to prove himself every second." Yamada's smile was gentle as he placed a hand on Aizawa's shoulder. "And we're going to give him that, Shoyuta. Whatever it takes." Aizawa nodded, a sense of determination settling over him. "If he does say yes, we'll have to be consistent. He's been running on his own strength for so long that it'll take time for him to realize he doesn't have to fight alone. But I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." Yamada's eyes sparkled with a familiar warmth. "Then we'll wait. And we'll be ready when he's ready." The two shared a quiet moment, letting the silence speak for them. Aizawa knew that Yamada was fully invested in this decision, just as he was. Together, they could offer Bakugou a place to belong, a family that didn't come with strings or expectations. For Bakugou, they would create a sanctuary, a home. The rest of the evening passed in comfortable silence as they shared a simple meal, both of them occasionally bringing up little ideas and adjustments they might make to welcome Bakugou. Yamada suggested putting together a few small essentials in a guest room, nothing flashy, but just enough to make it feel personal if Bakugou decided to stay. Aizawa agreed, liking the idea of setting up a space that felt like it was meant for him without overwhelming him with decorations or fuss. By the time they had cleaned up and settled onto the couch, Aizawa's mind was still spinning with thoughts about how they might help Bakugou. They talked long into the night, planning and hoping, And it wasn't until the early hours that they finally went to bed, ready to wait patiently for Bakugou to make his decision. In the quiet darkness, as he drifted to sleep, Aizawa felt a quiet sense of hope. Whatever Bakugou decided, they would be there for him. They would give him a place to rest, to grow, and, perhaps most importantly, to find peace. Chapter 2. Bakugou lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling as the words replayed in his mind. If you ever need a place to stay. Yamada and I are here. No pressure, no obligation. Aizawa's voice echoed in his head, calm and steady, the offer so unexpected that it had caught Bakugou off guard. He clenched his fists, frustration mingling with confusion. He didn't need anyone to help him or give him a place to stay. He was fine on his own, always had been. He was strong, independent, able to handle anything thrown his way. So why was he lying here, feeling something gnawing at his chest, something that almost felt like relief? Bakugou scowled, hating the idea that a part of him might actually want to accept Aizawa's offer. He didn't want to depend on anyone, he didn't want to feel like he needed anything other than his own strength. But as much as he tried to push the thought away, it lingered, growing louder the more he tried to ignore it. There was a strange ache that crept up whenever he thought about it, about the idea of having a place where he could let down his guard, even for a moment. The idea felt foreign, uncomfortable. But maybe, just maybe, it was also something he needed. I don't need anyone, he muttered to himself, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. But even as he said it, a part of him recognized the lie. He was exhausted, more than he'd ever admit to anyone. The late nights spent awake, the days where his training pushed him to the brink of collapse, it all felt like a never-ending loop. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to break that cycle. The thought of going home tonight, of facing the same routine, filled him with an odd sense of dread. His parents didn't understand his drive, didn't understand why he pushed himself so hard. They expected him to be the best, but they didn't see the toll it took. They didn't know what it felt like to carry so much weight alone. Bakugou sighed, feeling the conflict twist in his chest. Aizawa's offer felt like a lifeline, but taking it would mean admitting that he couldn't handle everything by himself. It would mean lowering the walls he'd built so carefully around himself, even if just a little. That idea alone was enough to make his skin crawl, but the thought of ignoring the offer felt even worse. With a growl, he sat up, clenching his fists. If he was going to do this, he would do it on his own terms. He'd set the rules, make it clear that he didn't need anything from them other than a place to stay temporarily. This wasn't about weakness, it was about strategy, a way to refocus himself and get stronger. He would make that clear to Aizawa, no pity, no coddling, just space to be himself without the expectations constantly weighing him down. Bakugou took a deep breath, steeling himself. He grabbed his phone and stared at it for a moment before finally pulling up Aizawa's number. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen as 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Was this the right choice? Was he making a mistake? Just do it, he told himself, scowling. It's just temporary. Nothing has to change. Before he could overthink it, he typed out a brief message. Sensei. I'll take you up on the offer. Just for a bit. He stared at the words for a moment, feeling his heart hammer in his chest, then hit send before he could talk himself out of it. The message felt strangely final, like he'd taken the first step down a path he couldn't turn back from. But a part of him, deep down, felt lighter. He tossed his phone aside, lying back on his bed and staring at the ceiling again. It was done. He'd made his choice. Now all he had to do was follow through. That night, Bakugou tossed and turned, sleep eluding him as his mind raced. He kept imagining what it would be like, stepping into Aizawa and Yamada's place, seeing how they lived. The idea of being part of their family, even temporarily, was uncomfortable and strange. He didn't know how to fit into a world where people genuinely cared about him without expecting anything in return. He grumbled to himself, pulling the blanket over his head as he tried to block out the thoughts. This was just temporary, he reminded himself. It didn't mean anything. He would go, stay for a bit, maybe get his mind straight, and then he'd be back to his old routine. This wasn't about being vulnerable or letting anyone in, it was about finding a place where he could refocus, that was all. But as much as he tried to convince himself, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was something more. The next morning, Bakugou found himself standing outside Aizawa's office, his heart pounding. He scowled, annoyed at his own nerves. This wasn't a big deal. It was just a place to stay, nothing more. Taking a deep breath, he raised his hand and knocked. Aizawa opened the door, his expression calm as he looked at Bakugou. There was no surprise in his eyes, just a quiet understanding that made Bakugou's nerves settle, if only slightly. So, Aizawa said simply, gesturing for him to come in. You're ready? Bakugou nodded, his jaw set. Yeah. But just for a while, he clarified, his voice firm. I don't need anyone looking after me. I'm just taking a break. Aizawa didn't react, simply nodding. Understood. Let's go over a few things. They sat down, and Aizawa laid out some basic expectations, things that Bakugou expected, but hearing them still felt strangely reassuring. He wouldn't have to do anything he didn't want to. He'd have his own space, and he could come and go as he pleased. It was simple, straightforward. Just the way he liked it. And Bakugou, Aizawa added, his tone softening slightly, this is your space. If you decide at any point that you want to leave, you're free to do so. No strings attached. But if you choose to stay, know that we're here to support you, no matter what. Bakugou glanced away, uncomfortable with the sincerity in Aizawa's voice. He wasn't used to people offering help without expecting something in return, and he didn't quite know how to respond. All he could manage was a brief nod. With that, they finished up the arrangements, and Aizawa told him to come by that evening. Bakugou left the office feeling strangely weightless, as if a burden had been lifted, even though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to admit it. As he made his way through the halls, he kept reminding himself that this was just temporary. A break. Nothing more. But a small part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he was on the brink of something new. Bakugou took a deep breath as he stood in front of the modest apartment building, his fists clenched at his sides. It was early evening, the streetlights just starting to flicker on, casting a soft glow over the quiet neighborhood. This was Aizawa and Yamada's place, a world that, up until now, he had only seen from a distance. The thought of actually being invited in, of being a part of it, even temporarily, felt strange. It's just temporary, he reminded himself, his scowl deepening. Asterisk, I'm here to get my head straight, that's all. Nothing has to change, asterisk. He adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder, gripping it tightly as he walked up to the door and knocked, each sound echoing louder than it should have in the evening silence. For a moment, he considered turning around and leaving, but the door opened before he could act on the impulse. Yamada greeted him, his usual bright smile toned down to something more subdued. He wore a comfortable sweater, his hair tied back, looking more like a friendly neighbor than the boisterous hero. Present, Mike. Yo, Bakugou. Right on time, he said, his voice warm. Come on in. Bakugou hesitated, his gaze flickering over Yamada's welcoming expression, before he finally stepped inside. The apartment was modest but cozy, filled with warm lighting and a few personal touches that hinted at Aizawa and Yamada's personalities. He could see bookshelves packed with an assortment of novels, a few framed photos, and a soft, worn rug that covered part of the floor. It felt real, in a way that his own home never had. Shouda's just getting a few things ready, Yamada said, gesturing for Bakugou to follow him further into the apartment. You can drop your bag here if you want. Make yourself comfortable. Bakugou placed his bag down, glancing around, feeling oddly out of place. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been in someone else's home like this, somewhere that wasn't filled with tension or high expectations. He didn't quite know what to make of it. Aizawa entered the room, his expression calm and unreadable as always, but Bakugou thought he saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. Glad you made it, Aizawa said, his tone as even as ever. I'll show you to your room. Bakugou nodded stiffly, following Aizawa down the hallway. He noticed how the walls were decorated with photos and a few drawings, probably gifts from students over the years. There was a feeling of warmth that Bakugou found both comforting and foreign, something he wasn't sure how to handle. Aizawa stopped at a door and opened it, gesturing for Bakugou to enter. This is your space, he said simply. We kept things basic, so feel free to adjust it however you like. If you need anything, just let us know. Bakugou stepped inside, taking in the small room. It was simple, with a bed, a desk, and a small dresser. A neatly folded set of sheets lay on the bed, along with a blanket and pillow. The window faced the street, letting in a faint glow from the street lights outside. It wasn't flashy or overly decorated, but there was something about it that felt calming. He set his bag down, glancing back at Aizawa, who was watching him with that same unreadable expression. Bakugou felt a strange urge to say something, to acknowledge the effort they'd put into this, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded. Aizawa seemed to understand, giving him a small nod in return. Take your time getting settled. Yamada's making tea if you want to join us in the kitchen when you're ready. Bakugou looked away, focusing on the room instead of the strange sense of gratitude welling up inside him. Yeah. Sure, he mumbled. Aizawa left, closing the door gently behind him, leaving Bakugou alone with his thoughts. He exhaled slowly, sitting down on the edge of the bed as he took in the space. There was a feeling of quiet here, something that seemed to settle into his bones, easing the tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. It was strange, comforting, but also unfamiliar. He was used to the noise, the constant pressure of home, where every interaction felt like a battle for dominance or approval. After a few minutes, he decided to venture into the kitchen. If he was going to be here, he might as well get a feel for the place. He squared his shoulders, setting his expression to its usual scowl as he walked down the hallway. When he entered the kitchen, he found Yamada pouring tea into 3 mismatched mugs. The table was set with a small plate of cookies, simple and unassuming, but something about it made Bakugou pause. It felt oddly welcoming, in a way he hadn't expected. Yamada looked up and grinned, sliding a mug across the table toward him. Here you go, Bakugou. Just plain green tea, nothing fancy. Shida's already helping himself, so feel free to grab a seat. Bakugou took the mug, hesitating for a moment before sitting down. He glanced at Aizawa, who was sipping his tea quietly, his expression as calm as ever. It was strange, sitting here in this casual setting, surrounded by the simple comforts of home. He could almost forget that he was sitting across from 2 of UA's most respected heroes. The silence in the room was comfortable, a stark contrast to the constant noise and tension he was used to. Aizawa and Yamada weren't watching him closely or peppering him with questions. They simply let him sit, letting the quiet moments speak for themselves. Yamada took a sip of his tea, breaking the silence with a gentle smile. So, Bakugou, we're not big on rules here, but if there's anything you need, just let us know. We want you to feel comfortable. Bakugou nodded stiffly, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to this kind of straightforward kindness. I don't need much, he muttered. Just the basics. Aizawa's gaze softened, and he nodded in understanding. Then that's all we'll provide. You have your own space, and you're welcome to join us for meals or keep to yourself. Whatever works for you. Bakugou relaxed a fraction, appreciating that they weren't going to press him. The tension in his shoulders eased, and he found himself sipping the tea, the warmth settling into him in a way that felt oddly grounding. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, the faint sounds of the city outside creating a soft backdrop to the quiet comfort of the kitchen. Bakugou felt the initial discomfort of being in someone else's space begin to fade, replaced by a sense of tentative acceptance. He still didn't know how this would play out, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying everything alone. As he sat there, listening to Yamada hum softly to himself and Aizawa's quiet presence across the table, Bakugou felt something shift within him. This wasn't home, not yet, at least, but it was something he could get used to. Maybe, just maybe, he'd made the right choice. Dinner that night was simple. Yamada had prepared a few dishes that were easy to make and familiar. A steaming bowl of rice, stir-fried vegetables, and grilled fish sat on the table, filling the room with a comforting aroma. Bakugou glanced at the spread as he sat down, feeling a mixture of surprise and something else, something softer that he couldn't quite name. Yamada brought over a pitcher of water, setting it down with a cheerful smile. "Hope this is okay, Bakugou. We didn't go all out or anything, but it's good, hearty food." Bakugou nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "It's fine. Looks good," he said quietly, almost begrudgingly, but he was telling the truth. The food looked simple but inviting, and it was different from the elaborate meals his mother often insisted on at home, where every detail was scrutinized. Aizawa sat down across from him, reaching for the rice bowl and serving himself before passing it along. There was an ease to his movements, a quiet confidence that set the tone without feeling overbearing. Bakugou appreciated that they weren't hovering or asking him a million questions. They just let him be. Yamada handed him a serving of vegetables and fish, his smile gentle but unassuming. "No pressure to talk if you don't want to, Bakugou. Just eat up. We're glad to have you here, that's all." Bakugou muttered a quick thanks, feeling a bit uncomfortable under the kindness, though it wasn't unwelcome. As they began eating, he noticed the way Aizawa and Yamada interacted, a natural rhythm that was both casual and attentive. Yamada talked about his day, sharing funny little stories about his students, and Aizawa would listen, occasionally adding a comment here and there, his tone light. At one point, Yamada let out a laugh, his eyes crinkling with genuine amusement. "And get this, Shoyuta, one of the kids tried to challenge me to a screaming match today. They thought they could beat Present Mike at his own game." Aizawa rolled his eyes, but there was a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm surprised you didn't take it as an actual challenge." "Nah," Yamada said, chuckling. "Wouldn't be fair. Gotta give the kids a chance to dream, right?" Bakugou couldn't help the small smirk that crept onto his face. The easy banter between them was strange, but in a way that made him feel oddly at ease. There was no underlying tension, no pressure to impress. It was just calm. The meal continued with gentle conversation. Yamada asked him a few casual questions, nothing prying, just things about school and his hobbies, but Bakugou didn't mind. The questions weren't loaded, and he found himself answering without the usual resistance he felt when people prodded into his life. As the meal wound down, Yamada stood up and started clearing the dishes, humming softly to himself. Bakugou glanced at Aizawa, who was leaning back in his chair, observing him with a calm but thoughtful gaze. "Is everything okay, Bakugou?" Aizawa asked, his tone casual but laced with a subtle sincerity that Bakugou wasn't used to. Bakugou nodded, setting down his chopsticks. "Yeah. It's fine," he said, feeling the inadequacy of the words but unsure of how else to express himself. He wanted to say more, to acknowledge the strange feeling of being here, of feeling comfortable in a way he didn't quite understand. But the words stuck in his throat. Aizawa seemed to understand, simply nodding in response. "Good. Take your time adjusting. There's no rush." Yamada returned to the table, wiping his hands on a towel as he looked between the two of them with a bright grin. "All right, Bakugou. since you're officially our guest, I say we let you off dish duty tonight. But tomorrow, you're on the roster, if that's alright. Bakugou blinked, surprised by the request. He wasn't used to being part of household chores, let alone being asked like this. At home, his mother would either handle everything herself or assign tasks with an expectation that they'd be done without question. The way Yamada presented it, as an option, a request, felt strangely respectful. Yeah, I can do that, he replied, feeling a hint of pride that he'd be trusted with something as mundane as dish duty. It was a small thing, but it made him feel included. After dinner, Aizawa and Yamada let him be, giving him the space to explore the apartment on his own. He took a few quiet minutes to walk around, observing the little details that filled their home, the photos, the books, the odd trinkets that Yamada had collected over the years. There were small signs of a life lived together, little touches that showed care and intention. He returned to his room, setting his bag down on the bed as he took a deep breath. The evening had gone more smoothly than he'd expected, but there was still a part of him that felt wary, uncertain of what this arrangement would bring. He wasn't used to people who offered things without strings, who gave him a choice without expecting something in return. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, he let himself exhale, feeling the weight of the day settle over him. He could still hear Yamada's laughter echoing faintly from down the hall, accompanied by Aizawa's steady voice. For a moment, he just listened, letting the quiet hum of their voices ground him. This isn't permanent, he reminded himself, clenching his fists. It's just a break. A chance to clear my head. But even as he repeated the thought, there was a small part of him that wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could get used to this. The calm, the warmth, the feeling of being in a place where he wasn't constantly on edge, he hadn't realized how much he needed it until he'd found himself here. As he lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, he felt a faint flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope, perhaps. The idea that, maybe, he didn't have to go back to the way things were. Maybe there was a different way to live, one that didn't require him to carry everything on his own. He closed his eyes, letting the thought linger as he drifted off to sleep, the sounds of Yamada and Aizawa's voices lulling him into a quiet, peaceful rest. Chapter 3. Bakugou's first few days with Aizawa and Yamada were strange, though not unpleasant. The quiet rhythms of their home life were nothing like what he was used to, and it took him some time to adjust to the new routines. Unlike the strict, structured expectations he was accustomed to, Aizawa and Yamada's approach was subtle, almost understated, as if they were giving him space to settle in on his own terms. Mornings, he soon discovered, were low-key. Aizawa, who rose early, would often be up before Bakugou, seated at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of coffee and a pile of papers he seemed to be reviewing for class. He'd offer Bakugou a simple nod of acknowledgement as he passed, never pressing for conversation or trying to fill the silence. Bakugou found himself appreciating the quiet, though he wasn't sure if he'd ever admit it out loud. One morning, as he poured himself a glass of water, he noticed Aizawa watching him, his gaze thoughtful, but unreadable. "Sleep well?" Aizawa asked casually, his tone as neutral as ever. Bakugou shrugged, setting the glass down. "Yeah. Room's quiet." Aizawa nodded, his gaze returning to his paperwork. "Good. If you need anything adjusted, just let me know." Bakugou muttered a quick thanks, feeling a strange warmth at the thought that they would actually make adjustments for him if he needed it. It was a simple thing, but it left him feeling oddly respected, like his comfort mattered here. Yamada, on the other hand, was rarely up early. He'd often shuffle into the kitchen later, bleary-eyed and wrapped in a warm robe, his hair a mess of blonde strands sticking out in every direction. Bakugou couldn't help but smirk the first time he saw it, present Mike, always so put together in public, looking almost comically human before his first cup of coffee. "Morning, Bakugou." Yamada greeted him one morning, a lazy smile on his face as he reached for the coffee pot. "How's it going so far?" Fine, Bakugou replied, trying to keep his tone even. He wasn't used to these casual greetings, the way Yamada's voice seemed to fill the kitchen with warmth even when he was barely awake. It was different, but he couldn't deny that it felt nice. Yamada chuckled, pouring himself a mug of coffee and taking a long sip. Good to hear. Let us know if you need anything, alright? Bakugou only nodded, feeling an odd sense of gratitude that he didn't quite know how to express. They kept their interactions simple, but there was a sense of ease that he found himself settling into, a feeling of being part of the rhythm of their home without any pressure to perform. After the first few mornings, Bakugou noticed that the small routines began to feel almost comfortable. He started making his own breakfast, something quick and straightforward, and he'd sometimes catch Yamada and Aizawa sharing small conversations as they moved about the kitchen. There was an ease between them that he didn't recognize, a quiet respect that spoke of years spent together, of knowing each other's habits and preferences without needing to say much. By the third morning, Bakugou found himself instinctively washing his own dishes, falling into step with the understated structure of their household. There were no rules posted, no explicit expectations, but he began to understand that certain things were simply done out of respect for the space they shared. One evening, Yamada mentioned that he'd set up a small rotation for dinner duties, asking Bakugou if he'd mind helping out a couple of times a week. It wasn't a demand, just a question, as if they genuinely wanted his input. Do what you want, Bakugou replied gruffly, though he added, I don't mind cooking a couple of times. I know how to handle myself in a kitchen. Yamada's face lit up. Perfect. That means we're in for some quality meals. You're alright with Wednesdays? Bakugou shrugged. Sure. Wednesdays work. And so, he found himself pulled into the fabric of their routines, little by little. He wasn't used to the idea of a chore rotation that felt more like teamwork than an order, but he had to admit it was effective. He'd chop vegetables alongside Yamada or set the table while Aizawa finished up grading papers, each of them moving around the kitchen like a well-rehearsed dance. It was efficient and simple, and Bakugou appreciated that. As he became more accustomed to their home life, Bakugou found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The small rituals, like cooking together, tidying up after meals, or even just sitting in comfortable silence in the living room, began to feel familiar, almost grounding. There was a sense of stability that he hadn't realized he craved, a quiet structure that allowed him to breathe without the weight of constant pressure or expectation. One night, as they sat down to a simple dinner of rice, grilled chicken, and vegetables, Bakugou found himself watching the way Aizawa and Yamada interacted, their small gestures of care and unspoken understanding. He noticed how Yamada would occasionally place a hand on Aizawa's arm as he spoke, or how Aizawa would refill Yamada's water glass without asking, as if it were second nature. It was a rhythm that spoke of trust and familiarity, and it left Bakugou feeling both curious and uncertain. The dinner was quiet, just the clinking of utensils and the soft murmur of conversation. Yamada asked him about his classes, nothing too probing, just enough to make him feel like they were interested. Aizawa listened, occasionally nodding or offering a small comment, his presence calm and steady. As they finished eating, Bakugou volunteered to help with the dishes, a gesture that came almost instinctively. Yamada looked pleasantly surprised, a warm smile spreading across his face. Thanks, Bakugou. That'd be great, he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. Bakugou shrugged, grabbing a towel and starting to dry the plates that Yamada handed him from the sink. It was a simple task, but he found himself focusing on it, feeling a strange sense of contentment in the repetitive motion, the quiet rhythm of working side by side. When they finished, Yamada gave him a friendly nudge on the shoulder. You're fitting right in here, Bakugou. Thanks for helping out, it means a lot. Bakugou didn't respond immediately, caught off guard by the comment. Fitting in. He hadn't thought of it like that, but a part of him couldn't deny that he felt more settled here than he had in a long time. It was strange, almost disorienting, but there was also a small flicker of warmth that made him feel accepted. He gave a small nod, avoiding Yamada's gaze as he muttered, "No problem. Just doing my part." As he retreated to his room that night, Bakugou found himself mulling over the events of the day. The way the routines had begun to feel familiar, almost comfortable. The sense of acceptance lingered, and though he tried to brush it off, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was finding a place for himself here. It's just temporary, he reminded himself, but the thought felt less certain than it had before. For now, he was content to leave it at that, allowing himself to enjoy the quiet stability, even if just for a while. As the days passed, Bakugou began noticing the subtle, almost effortless way Yamada and Aizawa showed their care. It wasn't loud or demanding, it was woven into the small moments, the way Yamada left extra breakfast out for him on the mornings he woke up late, or how Aizawa would casually remind him to get enough rest after particularly intense training sessions. The gestures were so natural that Bakugou often didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to people giving without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, he came back from training, his arms sore and his mind buzzing from the day's exercises. He hadn't gone easy on himself, pushing his body to its limits, and now the familiar ache settled into his muscles. He entered the apartment, greeted by the quiet hum of Yamada's music playing softly from the speakers. The scent of something warm and spicy lingered in the air, hinting that Yamada had been cooking. Yamada poked his head out from the kitchen, a cheerful grin on his face. "Hey, Bakugou. Training go well?" Bakugou gave a short nod, kicking off his shoes and rubbing his sore shoulder. "Yeah. Just the usual stuff." Yamada stepped into the living room, eyeing him with a hint of concern. "You look like you've been through the ringer, kiddo. Take it easy tonight, alright?" Bakugou's first instinct was to shrug it off, to snap back that he didn't need anyone telling him how to handle himself. But something in Yamada's tone made him pause. It wasn't pity or patronizing, it was just a gentle reminder, spoken with genuine care. "Fine," Bakugou muttered, his gaze fixed on the floor. He felt his face heat up, and used to this kind of concern directed his way. Yamada chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. Oh, and Shoyuta mentioned he'd help you with some recovery stretches if you're up for it. Said it might help you avoid burnout." Bakugou blinked, surprised. Aizawa had offered to help him with his training? He glanced toward Aizawa's room, his curiosity piqued. He wasn't used to his teachers taking an interest in his personal growth like this, not in a way that felt personal. After a quick dinner, Bakugou found himself in the living room with Aizawa, who had already laid out a mat on the floor. Aizawa's expression was calm and focused as he gestured for Bakugou to join him. "We'll keep this simple," he said. "Just a few stretches and techniques to help you recover after intense workouts." Bakugou nodded, setting himself up on the mat and mimicking Aizawa's posture. They worked in silence at first, Aizawa guiding him through a series of stretches, adjusting his form with quiet, precise instructions. It was a strange experience. Aizawa's movements were measured and intentional, and Bakugou found himself focusing on every detail, following along as closely as he could. After a few minutes, Aizawa glanced over at him, his gaze thoughtful. "You push yourself hard, Bakugou. That's a good quality, but remember that balance is important. Too much strain can lead to setbacks." Bakugou gritted his teeth, a part of him bristling at the advice. "I don't like holding back," he replied, his voice firm. "If I want to get stronger, I have to give it everything." Aizawa nodded, as if he understood. "True. But giving everything doesn't mean ignoring your limits. Strength isn't just about pushing, it's about knowing when to pull back, too. There's a reason heroes work in teams. We rely on each other to keep moving forward without burning out." Bakugou absorbed the words, feeling the weight of them settle into his mind. Aizawa wasn't just talking about training, he was talking about trust, about understanding that strength could come from others as much as it came from oneself. The realization left Bakugou feeling unsettled, but there was a part of him that wanted to believe it. Fine, Bakugou muttered, though his tone lacked its usual bite. I'll work on it. Aizawa gave a small nod of approval, his gaze steady. Good. It's not about changing who you are, it's about making sure you can keep going. They continued in silence, Aizawa guiding him through the final stretches, before releasing him with a brief nod. That should be enough for tonight. Let me know if you need any adjustments. Bakugou stood, rolling his shoulders as he tested the results of the session. The soreness had eased somewhat, and he felt lighter, more at ease. He mumbled a quiet, thanks, before retreating to his room, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and confusion. Over the next few days, Bakugou found himself growing more accustomed to the subtle ways Yamada and Aizawa supported him. Yamada's light-hearted nature added a sense of warmth to their interactions, filling the home with an energy that Bakugou hadn't experienced before. It was the kind of energy that made even the small things feel significant, like the way Yamada would laugh at his own jokes, filling the room with a sound that made Bakugou's scowl soften, even if just for a moment. One evening, Yamada brought home takeout, a spontaneous gesture he claimed was to celebrate the end of a long week. He spread the containers out on the kitchen table, grinning as he handed Bakugou a set of chopsticks. Dig in. Consider this a treat for all the hard work you've been putting in. Bakugou looked at the spread, feeling a strange sense of appreciation for the gesture. He wasn't used to people acknowledging his efforts like this, especially not in a casual, unassuming way. He muttered a quick, thanks, before grabbing a piece of tempura, pretending not to notice Yamada's pleased expression. As they ate, Yamada told him stories about his early days as a hero, regaling him with tales of rookie mistakes and close calls. Bakugou found himself listening intently, captivated by the stories, even letting out a short laugh when Yamada described an incident where he'd accidentally set off his own alarm system during a patrol. Don't let Shoryuta fool you, either, Yamada added with a grin. He was a hot-headed rookie back in the day. You wouldn't believe the stunts he used to pull. Aizawa, who had been quietly eating across the table, raised an eyebrow. I seem to remember someone else getting scolded for sneaking into restricted areas. Yamada laughed, nudging Bakugou conspiratorially. See what I mean? He can't deny it. Bakugou smirked, feeling a flicker of amusement. It was strange, sitting here and sharing a meal, listening to stories that felt oddly intimate. There was a part of him that wanted to resist, to remind himself that this was temporary, but the warmth of their laughter, the way they welcomed him without question, left him feeling safe. As the night went on, he allowed himself to relax, if only a little, letting their voices fill the space around him. There was a comfort here, an unfamiliar but welcome feeling that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him in this strange, warm world they had created. The days passed in a comfortable rhythm, each one blurring into the next as Bakugou settled into Aizawa and Yamada's home. He'd become accustomed to their routines, the quiet warmth they brought to his life, and the way they let him just be. But as the familiarity grew, so did a nagging doubt that crept in during the quiet moments, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his room, the doubt surfaced more strongly than ever. He stared at the plain walls, his thoughts churning. A part of him wondered if he was becoming too comfortable, too soft. He had always prided himself on his strength, on his ability to push forward no matter what, but here, he was beginning to feel relaxed. It was a feeling he didn't know how to handle, and it left him feeling vulnerable, exposed. Is this making me weaker? He wondered, his fists clenching. What if I lose my edge? What if this comfort takes away what makes me strong? The thought unsettled him deeply. Strength had always been his identity, his guiding force, the thing that set him apart. But here, in this quiet, supportive environment, he felt that identity slipping, softening under the warmth and acceptance that Yamada and Aizawa offered without condition. Feeling restless, he got up and left his room, walking down the hallway toward the living room. He was planning to go outside, maybe blow off steam with a quick run, but he stopped short when he saw Aizawa sitting on the couch, reading a book by the dim light of a table lamp. Aizawa looked up, his expression calm as always, though there was a faint hint of curiosity in his gaze. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and even. Bakugou hesitated, his usual bravado fading in the quiet of the moment. "Just needed some air," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Aizawa studied him for a moment, then set his book down, his attention fully on Bakugou. "Something on your mind?" Bakugou bristled at the question, but there was a part of him that wanted to answer, to voice the concerns that had been gnawing at him. He looked away, his jaw clenched as he struggled to find the right words. After a tense pause, he finally spoke, his voice low. "I'm starting to wonder if staying here is making me weaker. I've always had to keep pushing, keep my guard up. But here, I'm starting to let it down, and I don't know if that's a good thing." Aizawa nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand. Change can feel uncomfortable, especially when it challenges what you're used to. But letting your guard down doesn't make you weaker, Bakugou. Sometimes, it takes more strength to allow yourself to trust and to be vulnerable." Bakugou frowned, absorbing Aizawa's words with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "I don't want to lose what makes me strong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't afford that." Aizawa leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Strength isn't just about being on guard all the time. It's about knowing when to rely on others, when to accept support. Heroes don't stand alone, Bakugou. They build connections, they trust. That's what allows them to keep going, even when things get tough." Bakugou's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing as he processed Aizawa's words. "But, doesn't that make you vulnerable?" Aizawa's expression softened, and he nodded. "Yes, it does. But vulnerability doesn't mean weakness. It means you're human, that you're willing to share the weight instead of carrying it alone. There's a difference." Bakugou looked away, feeling the truth of Aizawa's words settle over him like a weight. He didn't want to admit it, but there was a part of him that craved that connection, that wanted to believe that he could rely on others without sacrificing his strength. Aizawa's voice softened. "Bakugou, you've been carrying a lot on your own for a long time. Letting others in doesn't take away from who you are. It adds to it. It gives you the chance to grow, to learn from those around you, and to become even stronger than you are now." Bakugou met his gaze, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He wanted to believe it, but the idea felt foreign, almost impossible. "I don't know if I can do that." Aizawa gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging the difficulty of what he was asking. "It's not something that happens overnight. It takes time and it's not easy. But you've already taken the first step by being here, by allowing yourself to experience something different. That's a kind of strength, too." Bakugou felt a faint spark of hope at Aizawa's words, a small but undeniable sense of relief. Maybe he didn't have to let go of his strength to be here. Maybe he could learn to trust, to let others in, without sacrificing who he was. After a moment, he nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll give it a shot." Aizawa's expression softened, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Good. Take it one step at a time. No one's expecting you to change overnight." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the quiet hum of the city outside filling the room. Bakugou felt a sense of calm settle over him, a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time, he felt a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, he could find a balance between strength and trust. Eventually, he stood up, glancing at Aizawa one last time. "Thanks for the talk," he muttered, feeling a bit awkward but genuinely grateful. Aizawa nodded, his expression warm. "Anytime, Bakugou. Remember, you're not alone in this." Bakugou made his way back to his room, his mind quieter than it had been in days. As he lay back on his bed, he allowed himself to think about Aizawa's words, letting the idea of strength and trust coexist in his mind. For the first time, he felt like he could breathe a little easier, like the weight he'd been carrying had lightened, if only slightly. And as he drifted off to sleep, he felt a faint sense of hope, a hope that maybe, he didn't have to carry everything alone after all. Chapter 4. Bakugou wasn't entirely sure why he felt so restless. The steady routine he'd fallen into with Aizawa and Yamada was comfortable, almost too comfortable, and the security of it made him feel like he should be on edge. It was strange, the way things felt easier here, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. That tension bubbled to the surface one evening during dinner. The day's training had been grueling, leaving him sore and frustrated, and the last thing he wanted was to sit down to another normal meal. But there they were, all seated at the table, sharing quiet conversation over rice and miso soup. Yamada had asked him a question, something about his progress in class. Bakugou heard himself snap a curt answer, his tone sharper than he intended. "I already told you, didn't I?" he said, his voice edged with irritation. "I don't need anyone checking up on me." Yamada paused, his chopsticks halfway to his mouth, a faint surprise flickering across his face. Bakugou braced himself, expecting a reprimand, maybe even a glare. But instead, Yamada just gave him a calm, easy smile, setting down his chopsticks with a gentle clink. "Got it. No pressure," Yamada said simply, his tone warm. "I was just curious, that's all. But if you'd rather not talk about it, that's fine." Bakugou blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the response. He'd expected pushback, some kind of lecture about respect or an annoyed look, at the very least. But Yamada's reaction was calm, almost understanding. The quiet acceptance threw him off balance, leaving him feeling exposed in a way he wasn't used to. He clenched his fists under the table, the sharp edge of his frustration blunting slightly. He wanted to lash out, to break through the uncomfortable kindness that was beginning to chip away at his defenses, but he couldn't find a reason to. Yamada's easygoing response had defused the situation before it even started. Aizawa, who had been observing quietly, gave him a calm look, his voice steady. "Bakugou, it's all right to feel frustrated. No one's expecting you to be perfect." The word struck a chord, and Bakugou felt a flicker of irritation rise up again. "I'm not trying to be perfect," he muttered, his voice low. "I'm just tired of everyone acting like they need to know what's going on with me." Aizawa nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's fair. But you're here now, and part of being here means that we'll naturally be curious about how you're doing. It doesn't mean we're prying, it just means we care." Bakugou let out a sharp breath, feeling the words settle into him in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. They weren't pushing him to open up, but they weren't ignoring him, either. It was a balance he hadn't experienced before, one that left him feeling both annoyed and strangely grateful. After a moment, he grunted, his gaze dropping to his plate. "Fine," he muttered, though his tone lacked its usual bite. "Just don't expect me to get all soft or something." Yamada let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Wouldn't dream of it, Bakugou. We know you're tough. That's one of the things we like about you." Bakugou's ears turned slightly pink, and he focused on his food, unsure of how to respond to that. Compliments were few and far between in his world, and receiving one here, in such a straightforward way, felt unfamiliar, almost overwhelming. He kept his gaze down, eating in silence as he tried to ignore the warmth creeping into his chest. For the rest of the meal, Yamada and Aizawa continued their conversation, occasionally glancing his way but never pressing him to speak. The tension in the room eased, replaced by the same calm rhythm that he was slowly coming to recognize as normal here. It was strange, this acceptance they offered so freely, and he found himself both drawn to it and wary of it. Later that night, as he lay in bed, Bakugou replayed the conversation in his mind, feeling the weight of Yamada and Aizawa's words settle over him. He wasn't used to this kind of openness, this quiet space where he could test boundaries without fear of judgment. Part of him wanted to push back harder, to see how far their acceptance stretched, but another part of him wondered if he even needed to. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a small sense of relief, a sense that, maybe, he didn't have to constantly be on guard here. Maybe, just maybe, he could let himself relax, if only a little. The next evening, Bakugou found himself lingering in the living room after dinner, a sense of restlessness tugging at him. He wasn't sure why he didn't go straight to his room like he usually did. Maybe it was the quiet comfort of the space, or maybe it was the warmth of Yamada's voice as he hummed a soft tune while drying the dishes. Whatever the reason, he stayed, feeling both tense and oddly at ease. Yamada noticed him hovering by the door and shot him a friendly smile. "Want to give me a hand with these?" he asked, gesturing to the stack of dishes. Bakugou hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping forward to help. He took a dish towel, drying each plate Yamada handed him, and for a few minutes, they worked in silence, the quiet rhythm of their movements filling the room. After a while, Yamada broke the silence, his tone light but thoughtful. "You know, you've been pushing yourself pretty hard lately, Bakugou. Aizawa and I both noticed." Bakugou tensed, bracing himself for some kind of lecture, but Yamada's voice remained calm, without a hint of judgment. "We're not telling you to slow down or anything," Yamada continued, glancing at him with a reassuring smile. "We know how driven you are, and that's a great thing. But sometimes, it's good to remember that you don't have to carry everything on your own." Bakugou's hand stilled, his grip tightening on the towel. He'd heard similar sentiments before, but always with an undertone of expectation, a subtle hint that he wasn't doing enough, that he needed to be better. But here, the words felt different, genuine, without any strings attached. He swallowed, feeling a surge of frustration mixed with something softer, something he couldn't quite name. I don't want people thinking I need help," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm supposed to be strong. That's what I am." Yamada nodded, his expression thoughtful as he set down the last dish. "I get that. And no one here thinks you're weak, Bakugou. We see how hard you work, how strong you are. But strength doesn't mean shutting everyone out. It means knowing when to let people in, too." Bakugou clenched his jaw, feeling a pang of vulnerability that made him want to retreat, to put up his walls and brush off the words. But something kept him there, kept him listening, the gentle acceptance in Yamada's tone grounding him. Aizawa joined them in the kitchen, leaning against the doorway with his usual calm demeanor. He met Bakugou's gaze, his expression steady. "Yamada's right. Being strong isn't just about handling everything alone. It's about knowing when to trust others, too." Bakugou looked away, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He wanted to argue, to tell them that he didn't need anyone, that he was fine on his own. But the truth was, he was tired. Tired of carrying everything, of always being on guard, of feeling like he had to prove himself at every turn. After a moment of silence, he muttered, "I just don't want to mess up. If I let people in, I might get distracted, might lose my focus." Yamada placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Trust me, Bakugou. Letting people in won't make you weaker. In fact, it might even make you stronger. You'll have people to support you, to keep you grounded." Aizawa nodded, his gaze steady. "We're not here to change who you are, Bakugou. We're here to support you, whatever that looks like. If you need to push yourself, go for it. But know that you don't have to do it alone." Bakugou felt a faint sense of relief at their words, a quiet reassurance that settled into him, easing the tension he'd been carrying. He still wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of relying on others, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to keep pushing them away. He let out a slow breath, nodding. "All right," he murmured. "I'll try." Yamada's face lit up with a warm smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's all we ask, Bakugou. Just take it one step at a time. You're doing great. For a moment, Bakugou allowed himself to believe it, letting the warmth of their acceptance settle over him. It was unfamiliar, this feeling of being supported without conditions, but it wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it felt safe. As they finished up in the kitchen, Bakugou felt a small sense of pride, a quiet victory in allowing himself to let his guard down, if only a little. And as he returned to his room that night, he felt lighter, more at ease, knowing that he didn't have to carry everything alone. The next morning, Bakugou woke up with an odd sense of calm. The tension that usually accompanied him throughout the day felt muted, softened by the quiet acceptance he'd experienced the night before. He moved through his morning routine with a renewed ease, noticing small details he'd previously ignored, the warmth of the sunlight streaming through his window, the gentle hum of the apartment as Yamada bustled around in the kitchen, the steady presence of Aizawa already up and reading at the table. When he entered the kitchen, Yamada greeted him with a cheerful, "Good morning, Bakugou." He handed him a plate of toast with a generous spread of jam and a bowl of miso soup. Bakugou took the plate, nodding his thanks, and sat down at the table. Aizawa looked up from his book, giving him a brief nod. "How'd you sleep?" Bakugou shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "Fine. Didn't wake up too much." Yamada poured himself a cup of coffee, sitting down beside them with an easy smile. "Glad to hear it. It's all about getting into a rhythm, right?" Bakugou nodded, feeling that they understood him without prying or pushing. There was a respect here, a mutual understanding that allowed him to feel more at ease. As they ate breakfast, he found himself starting to relax, the usual guardedness fading away. They talked about simple things, what Yamada had planned for his classes, a few updates on training schedules, and the new ramen place that had opened nearby. The conversation was light, unassuming, but it was the kind of comfortable interaction Bakugou hadn't realized he'd been missing. After breakfast, he helped clear the table, moving almost on instinct. Yamada noticed, his face lighting up with a grin. "Look at you, fitting right in. You're a natural, Bakugou." Bakugou scoffed, but there was no heat to it. "It's just dishes. Not that hard." Aizawa chuckled, giving him a knowing look. "Sometimes, it's the simple things that mean the most." Bakugou didn't respond, but he felt a flicker of warmth at Aizawa's words. He was starting to understand that it was these small acts, the shared meals, the quiet conversations, the unspoken gestures of care, that made this place feel different. It wasn't flashy or complicated, but it was real, and that made it valuable in a way he hadn't expected. As they finished up, Yamada clapped him on the shoulder, his voice softening. "Hey, Bakugou, we really appreciate having you here, you know? It's nice having someone else around. You bring a lot of energy to the place." Bakugou felt his face heat up, the unexpected praise catching him off guard. "Yeah, well, I guess it's not the worst place to be," he muttered, glancing away as he fought to keep his expression neutral. Yamada chuckled, giving him a light pat on the back. "That's the spirit. And just so you know, we're here anytime you need, okay? No strings attached." Bakugou nodded, feeling a strange sense of gratitude welling up in his chest. He wanted to say something, to express the appreciation he was feeling, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he did what he knew best, he acted. After a moment, he picked up the dish towel and began wiping down the counters, his movements brisk and efficient. It was a small gesture, but it was his way of showing that he cared, that he was willing to contribute. He didn't say a word, but Yamada's grin and Aizawa's approving nod told him that they understood. By the time they finished tidying up, Bakugou felt lighter, more grounded. For the first time, he felt like he belonged here, like he had a place in this quiet, steady rhythm they'd created together. It was a small victory, but it was his, and he was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep fighting alone. As he returned to his room to get ready for the day, He allowed himself a small smile, a quiet sense of pride settling over him. He still had a long way to go, and he knew he wasn't ready to let down his guard completely, but this was a start, a first step towards something new, something he hadn't even known he wanted. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 5. Bakugou was stretching in the training room one early morning when Aizawa appeared, his usual calm expression softened by a hint of curiosity. Bakugou had woken up early, his mind restless and filled with a desire to burn off some energy. He hadn't expected anyone else to be around, let alone Aizawa. Couldn't sleep? Aizawa asked, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Bakugou shrugged, avoiding eye contact. Just wanted to get some training in. Aizawa nodded, stepping into the room. Mind if I join you? I could use some extra practice myself. Bakugou blinked, surprised by the offer. He hadn't trained one-on-one with Aizawa before, and the idea left him feeling both intrigued and wary. Training was something he was used to doing alone, an act of self-improvement and self-discipline. But there was a part of him that wanted to see what he could learn from Aizawa, someone he respected and admired. Fine by me, Bakugou replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. Just don't expect me to go easy on you. Aizawa smirked. Wouldn't dream of it. They moved into position, starting with warm-up drills. Aizawa guided him through a series of intense exercises, each one designed to push his limits while refining his control. Bakugou found himself focusing intently, absorbing every bit of advice Aizawa gave him. It was rare for him to train with someone who truly understood his drive, who could match his intensity without flinching. As they moved into combat drills, Aizawa offered pointers, his voice steady and calm. Your power's strong, but remember that strength without control is wasted energy. Channel it with precision, not just force. Bakugou gritted his teeth, determined to meet the challenge. He threw himself into the exercises, adjusting his movements to align with Aizawa's guidance. With each correction, he could feel himself improving, his attacks becoming sharper, his movements more refined. The satisfaction that came with progress was palpable, and he could sense Aizawa's approval with each successful strike. At one point, Aizawa stopped him, his gaze focused. Bakugou, you're driven, that's obvious. But don't let that drive consume you. You have the potential to be an incredible hero, but only if you balance it with patience and awareness. Bakugou's eyes narrowed, the words hitting closer to home than he expected. I don't need to slow down, he replied, his tone defiant. I need to be better, stronger. Heroes don't get stronger by holding back. Aizawa's gaze didn't waver. True. But heroes also need to be aware of their own limits. Pushing yourself is important, but so is knowing when to pace yourself. There's a difference between being driven and being reckless. The words settled over Bakugou, challenging him in a way that made him feel both defensive and curious. He wanted to argue, to push back, but something in Aizawa's tone made him pause. He could sense the sincerity, the belief that these words weren't meant to hold him back, but to help him reach a level of strength he hadn't yet considered. After a moment, he nodded, a reluctant respect growing in his gaze. Fine. I get it. Aizawa gave him a small nod of approval. Good. You don't need to rush to prove yourself, Bakugou. You're already strong. Now it's about refining that strength. They continued their training, each drill building on the last, pushing Bakugou to channel his energy with precision rather than raw power. It was a new approach, one that required focus and control, and he could feel himself improving with each movement. The challenge was invigorating, filling him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a while. As they wrapped up, Aizawa handed him a water bottle, his expression thoughtful. You've got a lot of potential, Bakugou. Keep working on that balance, and you'll be unstoppable. Bakugou took the water bottle, glancing away as he muttered, Thanks, sensei. Aizawa's expression softened, a hint of pride in his eyes. You're welcome. remember, you don't have to do this alone. We're here to help you reach your goals, however we can. Bakugou nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude that left him momentarily speechless. It was rare for him to feel truly understood, to have someone recognize his potential without trying to change him. But Aizawa's support felt genuine, a quiet strength that reminded him that he didn't have to carry everything by himself. As they left the training room, Bakugou felt a newfound respect for Aizawa, a sense of trust that he hadn't experienced before. This training session had shown him that strength didn't have to come at the expense of connection, that trust and support could be part of his journey, too. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he could be strong without always going it alone. After a particularly intense week of training and studying, Bakugou returned home one evening to find Yamada setting up a projector in the living room, a stack of DVDs on the coffee table. The setup was unusual, and Bakugou raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms as he watched Yamada connect wires with enthusiasm. "What's all this?" Bakugou asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. Yamada looked up, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Movie night. Thought we could use a break, and I happen to have a killer collection of action movies." He held up a DVD case with a grin. "What do you think? Want to join?" Bakugou hesitated, his instinct telling him to brush it off. Movie nights weren't exactly his thing, and he was used to winding down alone after a long day. But something about the way Yamada's face lit up, his uncontainable enthusiasm, made Bakugou pause. It wasn't often that someone invited him to do something purely for fun, without any expectations. He shrugged, attempting to sound indifferent. "Fine. I guess I could watch one." Yamada's grin widened as he gestured for Bakugou to take a seat on the couch. "Perfect. We've got plenty of snacks, too, chips, popcorn, and I even snagged some mochi. We're doing this right." Bakugou rolled his eyes, but couldn't hide the faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He settled onto the couch, grabbing a handful of popcorn as Yamada started the movie. The screen flickered to life, filling the room with the sound of explosions and intense music as the film began. For the first few minutes, Bakugou maintained his usual guarded expression, watching the action unfold with a critical eye. But Yamada's infectious laughter and running commentary gradually began to wear down his defenses. Yamada pointed out ridiculous plot twists, cheered on the heroes, and even made exaggerated sound effects during the fight scenes, his enthusiasm filling the room with a sense of energy that Bakugou found hard to resist. Before he knew it, Bakugou was laughing along, his initial reluctance fading as he got caught up in the film. The plot was over the top, the action sequences almost laughably unrealistic, but for once, he let himself enjoy it without analyzing every detail. He was surprised by how freeing it felt, how easily the laughter came, unforced and genuine. At one particularly ridiculous scene, a car chase that ended with the hero crashing through a helicopter, Bakugou let out a loud, unrestrained laugh, his usual scowl giving way to a rare, unguarded grin. Yamada turned to him, grinning even wider. "See? You've got a great laugh, Bakugou," Yamada said, giving him a playful nudge. "Told you this would be fun." Bakugou rolled his eyes, though there was no real annoyance in his expression. Yeah. Don't get used to it." But despite his words, he felt a strange warmth settle in his chest. It had been a long time since he'd laughed like this, since he'd let himself relax without the weight of expectations pressing down on him. Yamada's light-hearted nature was disarming, a reminder that not everything had to be serious, that he could let go and still be himself. As the movie ended, Yamada switched off the projector, stretching his arms with a satisfied sigh. "Now that's what I call a good movie night. Think you'd be up for another one sometime?" Bakugou shrugged, fighting back a smile. "Maybe. If the next one's better than this mess," he replied, though there was a faint glint of excitement in his eyes. Yamada laughed, nudging him again. "Deal. I'll find something even crazier for next time." And maybe we'll get Shoyuta to join us, though he'll probably just fall asleep halfway through. Bakugou snorted at the image of Aizawa dozing off in the middle of an action movie, a rare smile spreading across his face. The idea of spending more time like this, in the company of people who accepted him without expectation, was something he hadn't considered before. It was strange, but he liked it, a feeling of belonging that wasn't tied to his performance or his achievements. As he helped Yamada tidy up, he felt a surge of gratitude, a quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be on guard all the time. He could let himself have moments like this, moments where he could laugh and relax, and it wouldn't take away from his strength. Before heading to his room, he paused, glancing back at Yamada. "Thanks," he muttered, his tone quiet but sincere. "For the movie and everything." Yamada's smile softened, his eyes warm with understanding. "Anytime, Bakugou. You deserve to have some fun, too." Bakugou nodded, feeling the words settle into him, filling the empty spaces he hadn't even realized were there. As he made his way to his room, he felt a sense of contentment, a quiet joy that lingered long after the laughter had faded. It was a small victory, a reminder that he could be strong and still find happiness in the simple things. And for once, he allowed himself to embrace it. The following evening, Bakugou found himself in the kitchen, quietly tidying up after dinner. Yamada had gone to prepare a lesson plan for the next day, and Aizawa was washing dishes beside him, his presence as steady and calm as ever. Bakugou appreciated these quiet moments, the comfortable silence they shared without the need for constant conversation. As they worked, Aizawa glanced over at him, his gaze thoughtful. "You've been pushing yourself pretty hard lately, Bakugou. I see it in your training and your focus. It's good, but it seems like you're carrying more than just drive." Bakugou's shoulders tensed, a flicker of defensiveness rising up. He wasn't used to people noticing the pressure he put on himself, let alone mentioning it so openly. But with Aizawa, there was no judgment, just quiet observation and understanding. It was a reminder that here, he didn't have to hide every part of himself. After a moment, he sighed, looking down at the plate he was drying. "I have to keep pushing," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I can't afford to fall behind. If I'm not the best, then, what's the point?" Aizawa listened, his expression patient and calm. "Why do you feel like you have to be the best? Is it something you want for yourself, or something you think others expect of you?" Bakugou gritted his teeth, the question digging into a part of him he wasn't sure he wanted to explore. He'd always told himself that his drive came from within, that it was his own ambition, pushing him forward. But there was another side to it, a constant pressure from his family, his classmates, and even his teachers, a pressure that sometimes felt impossible to escape. "It's both, I guess," he replied reluctantly. "I want to be the best, because I know I can be. But it's like, if I'm not constantly proving myself, people won't take me seriously. They'll just see me as another student with a quirk." Aizawa nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand. But Bakugou, your worth isn't defined by being the best. You're strong, talented, and dedicated, that's clear to everyone. But it's okay to find balance, to take time for yourself without feeling like you're falling behind." Bakugou looked away, feeling a mix of frustration and relief. He'd spent so much time striving for perfection, trying to live up to expectations, that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to just be himself, without constantly measuring his progress. Aizawa's words were challenging that mindset, offering him a different perspective. "But if I slow down," he muttered, "won't that make me weaker?" Aizawa shook his head, a faint smile on his face. "Not at all. In fact, taking care of yourself, physically and mentally, will only make you stronger in the long run. Pushing yourself to the edge constantly may get results now, but it'll burn you out eventually. You have a long career ahead of you, Bakugou. The goal isn't just to be the best now, it's to have the strength and resilience to keep going for years to come." Bakugou absorbed the words, feeling them settle into his mind like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was missing. A part of him had always believed that his strength was tied to his pace, that slowing down would mean losing his edge. But Aizawa's perspective was different, almost refreshing, a reminder that there was a path to greatness that didn't involve constant exhaustion and pressure. After a moment, he glanced back at Aizawa, his expression softer than usual. "It's hard," he admitted quietly. "I'm used to doing everything alone, pushing myself because, well, that's just what I do." Aizawa's gaze softened, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You don't have to do it alone, Bakugou. You have people around you who care, who want to help you succeed without you burning out in the process. Trusting others doesn't make you weak, it makes you smart. It allows you to take care of yourself while still reaching your goals." Bakugou nodded, a quiet sense of relief settling over him. It was strange, almost uncomfortable, to realize that he didn't have to carry everything alone. But it was also freeing, a reminder that he could share his burdens without compromising his strength. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice low but sincere. "I didn't expect to hear that, but it helps." Aizawa gave him a nod, his gaze filled with quiet understanding. "Anytime, Bakugou. Remember, you're not just here to be a hero, you're here to be yourself. And that's just as important as any title or accomplishment." Bakugou let the words sink in, feeling a faint smile tug at his lips. It was a small but powerful moment, a reminder that his journey wasn't just about proving himself, it was about finding a balance that would let him thrive, both as a hero and as a person. As they finished up in the kitchen, he felt a newfound sense of resolve. He still wanted to be the best, to prove his strength and achieve his goals. But now, he understood that he could do so without sacrificing himself, that he could let others in without losing his edge. It was a small victory, a step toward building a life where he could be strong and supported, ambitious and balanced. And as he made his way to his room that night, he allowed himself to feel a quiet sense of hope, a hope that he could forge his own path, one that included both strength and trust. Chapter 6. Over the next few days, Bakugou found himself growing accustomed to the quiet rhythm of life with Aizawa and Yamada. Their home was a place of stability, of small, unspoken routines that created a sense of calm he hadn't realized he was missing. And though he still kept his guard up, a part of him began to relax, his defenses softening in ways that felt strange, but good. It started with little things. He'd offer a quick nod when Yamada asked about his day, or a brief "fine" when Aizawa inquired about his training. For Bakugou, it was an unusual level of openness, a small step toward acknowledging that he was part of this household, even if he wasn't fully ready to embrace it yet. One evening, as he worked on homework at the kitchen table, he noticed Yamada fiddling with a loose cabinet door. Yamada grumbled under his breath as he tightened the screws, but it was clear that the door was stubborn, creaking every time he pushed it closed. Bakugou watched him for a moment, then stood up, walking over without a word. "Here," he muttered, holding out his hand. "Let me try." Yamada looked up, a grin spreading across his face as he handed Bakugou the screwdriver. "Thanks, Bakugou. This thing's been driving me nuts for weeks." Bakugou crouched down, examining the hinge carefully before applying a bit more pressure. He tightened the screws with a few precise turns, testing the door until it moved smoothly. Satisfied, he stood up, brushing off his hands. "There," he said, his tone casual. "Should hold now." Yamada's smile widened, a hint of pride in his gaze. "You're a lifesaver, Bakugou. Guess I should have asked you sooner." Bakugou shrugged, feeling a small surge of satisfaction at being useful. It was a minor task, nothing significant, but Yamada's appreciation felt genuine, unforced. It was different from the usual praise he received at school or during training. This was simple, grounded, and oddly comforting. Returning to his seat, Bakugou resumed his homework, but he found his mind lingering on the exchange, the ease with which he'd offered help without feeling the need to prove anything. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it marked a shift in the way he was beginning to approach life in this household. The next day, Bakugou came home feeling worn out from an especially tough training session. His muscles ached, and a dull headache throbbed at his temples. Usually, he'd push through, maybe go for a run to burn off the lingering frustration, but today, he found himself drifting into the kitchen, where Yamada was prepping dinner. Yamada looked up, noticing Bakugou's tired expression. "Rough day, huh?" Bakugou nodded, feeling his defenses slip just a little. "Yeah. Extra drills. Got pushed harder than usual." Yamada gave him an understanding nod. "Sounds like you could use a break. Dinner's almost ready, why don't you grab some water and chill out for a bit?" Normally, Bakugou would brush off the suggestion, insisting he was fine. But today, he found himself reaching for a glass of water, leaning against the counter as he watched Yamada chop vegetables, with practiced ease. The silence between them was comfortable, and for once, Bakugou didn't feel the need to fill it with words or explanations. After a few minutes, he spoke up, his tone quiet. "It's different here." Yamada paused, looking at him with a gentle curiosity. "Different how?" Bakugou shrugged, struggling to put the feeling into words. "I dunno. It's like, things don't have to be so intense all the time. You and Aizawa, you're just, here, doing your thing." Yamada smiled, nodding in understanding. "Yeah, I get that. Life doesn't always have to be high stakes, Bakugou. Sometimes, it's the small, everyday moments that help us feel grounded, connected." Bakugou considered the words, feeling them settle into his mind. He hadn't thought about it like that before. In his world, everything was a challenge, a test of strength and resilience. But here, there was a simplicity, a quiet rhythm that didn't demand anything from him beyond just being himself. As he took another sip of water, he found himself wondering if he could let himself lean into that rhythm a little more, if he could trust this sense of calm without losing his edge. Yamada finished chopping the vegetables and set them aside, glancing at him with a warm smile. "You're doing great, you know. Adjusting, finding your place. We're glad to have you here." Bakugou looked away, his face heating up slightly. "Yeah, well, don't get used to it," he muttered, though his tone lacked its usual bite. Yamada laughed, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "No pressure, Bakugou. Just glad you're here." As he headed back to his room, Bakugou felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It was a small thing, these moments of trust, of leaning in, but it was beginning to feel like something he could accept, like maybe it wasn't so bad to let his guard down, even if only a little. The next morning, Bakugou was back in the training room, determined to push past a goal he'd set for himself. He had been working on refining a complex combat maneuver, a sequence that required intense focus, precision, and power. No matter how many times he tried, he couldn't get it quite right, and his frustration was starting to boil over. He landed from a jump, his foot slipping slightly, causing his stance to falter. Growling in irritation, he clenched his fists, a faint glimmer of heat sparking around his hands. He could feel the frustration building, threatening to overflow, and his mind raced with the need to perfect the move. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, his frustration simmering as he reset his stance, preparing to try again. "Bakugou." Yamada's voice cut through his thoughts, and Bakugou glanced up, noticing that Yamada had entered the room, a supportive smile on his face. "You've been at this for a while now. Need any tips?" Bakugou tensed, his instinct telling him to brush off the offer. He was used to working through problems alone, pushing through until he got it right. But as he looked at Yamada, who was watching him with genuine interest and no judgment, he felt his resistance waver. "Fine," he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. "What do you got?" Yamada grinned, stepping closer as he took a moment to observe Bakugou's stance. "It looks like you're putting a lot of power into your movements, which is great, but that power can throw off your balance if it's not channeled properly. Try focusing on stability first, and let the power come naturally. Bakugou nodded, his expression serious as he processed the advice. He took a deep breath, grounding himself as he adjusted his stance, trying to focus on stability as Yamada suggested. With a renewed sense of focus, he went through the sequence again, this time feeling a subtle but noticeable improvement in his balance and precision. To his surprise, the movement flowed more smoothly, and he managed to execute the entire maneuver without stumbling. When he landed, he felt a surge of satisfaction, a quiet thrill that came from finally breaking through the barrier that had been holding him back. He looked at Yamada, a small but genuine spark of gratitude in his gaze. Guess that helped, he admitted, trying to keep his tone casual. Yamada gave him a friendly clap on the shoulder. Glad to hear it. You've got the power, Bakugou. Sometimes, it's just a matter of refining it. You don't always have to brute force your way through everything. Bakugou scowled, though there was no real annoyance behind it. Yeah. Don't get used to this, alright? Yamada chuckled, clearly unfazed. I wouldn't dream of it. But just so you know, I'm always here if you need a second pair of eyes. We're a team now, remember? Bakugou blinked, caught off guard by the statement. The word team echoed in his mind, filling him with a mix of warmth and discomfort. He hadn't thought of himself as part of a team before, at least not in this way. Being here with Aizawa and Yamada, training together, supporting each other, it was a new experience, one that left him feeling strangely grounded. Yeah, he muttered, his voice softer. I guess I could use a team sometimes. Yamada's face softened, and he nodded, his voice quiet but filled with pride. We're here for you, Bakugou. Always. The words settled over Bakugou, easing the tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. Accepting help hadn't made him weaker, it had helped him grow, pushing him past a limit he wouldn't have reached alone. It was a small victory, a reminder that strength wasn't just about independence, but also about knowing when to lean on those who had his back. As he left the training room, Bakugou felt a sense of pride mixed with gratitude, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was finally beginning to understand what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. Later that evening, Bakugou found himself seated on the balcony, the cool air brushing against his face as he stared out over the city lights. The training session with Yamada had left him feeling conflicted, grateful for the help, yet uncertain about this unfamiliar path of leaning on others. He was used to standing alone, carrying his weight and pushing himself forward without expecting support from anyone. A soft creak alerted him to someone else's presence, and he glanced back to see Aizawa stepping onto the balcony, his expression calm and thoughtful. Aizawa pulled up a chair beside him, sitting in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. Yamada told me about your training session, Aizawa said, his voice low. He said you made good progress. Bakugou nodded, looking down at his hands. Yeah. I guess. I needed a different approach. Aizawa gave a slight nod, his gaze steady. You know, it's not weakness to need help. There's a certain strength in accepting guidance, in realizing that you don't have to do everything on your own. Bakugou clenched his fists, feeling the weight of Aizawa's words. I'm just not used to it. All my life, I've been told to rely on my own strength, to be the best, no matter what. Asking for help always felt like a step back, like admitting I wasn't enough. Aizawa's gaze softened, and he placed a steady hand on Bakugou's shoulder. Strength isn't just about what you can do alone. It's about the resilience you build when you allow others to be part of your journey. True power comes from the connections you make and the trust you develop in those who have your back. Bakugou looked away, his mind racing as he processed the idea. Trust had always felt like a weakness to him, something that could make him vulnerable. But sitting here, with Aizawa beside him, he could feel a different kind of strength, a strength that came from being seen, understood, and valued. It's hard to change that mindset, Bakugou admitted quietly. I still feel like If I let people in too much, it'll make me soft. I don't want to lose my edge. Aizawa's hand remained steady on his shoulder. You won't lose your edge, Bakugou. In fact, the support you find here will help you sharpen it. You'll grow in ways you can't even imagine when you let yourself lean on others. And remember, trust doesn't mean you have to give up your independence. It just means you're letting us walk with you. The word struck a chord deep within Bakugou, a flicker of understanding blooming in his chest. He had always thought of strength as something that required isolation, a solitary path he had to walk alone. But here, with Aizawa's quiet encouragement and Yamada's constant support, he was starting to see that strength could also mean accepting help, that growth didn't have to come at the expense of connection. After a moment, he let out a quiet sigh, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I still don't know if I'm ready to be all open about everything, he muttered, glancing at Aizawa. But I'll try. A bit. Aizawa gave him a faint smile, his pride evident. That's all we ask, Bakugou. One step at a time. You're already stronger than you realize, and we're here to help you keep moving forward. Bakugou felt a warmth settle over him, a quiet reassurance that left him feeling more grounded than he had in a long time. The trust he was beginning to build here, the subtle encouragement he received, was helping him see a new side of himself, a side that didn't have to choose between strength and connection, but could embrace both. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the city lights flickering below them as a gentle breeze swept across the balcony. Bakugou felt the weight of his old beliefs start to shift, making room for something new, something he hadn't thought possible. As he stood up to head back inside, he glanced back at Aizawa, a rare look of gratitude in his eyes. Thanks, sensei. For everything. Aizawa's expression softened, and he gave a slight nod. Anytime, Bakugou. Remember, you're not alone. We're in this together. Bakugou returned to his room with a newfound sense of purpose, his heart lighter and his resolve stronger. He was beginning to understand that true strength wasn't just about standing alone, but about embracing the support of those who cared about him. And for the first time, he felt ready to let that strength grow, knowing that he didn't have to carry the weight by himself. Chapter 7. Bakugou sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall as his thoughts drifted back to his early days of training. He remembered the countless hours spent perfecting every move, the endless determination that pushed him forward, even when he felt close to breaking. Back then, it had always been about proving something, to himself, to his classmates, to anyone who doubted him. Strength, he had believed, was about standing alone, about rising to every challenge without leaning on anyone. But now, here in Aizawa and Yamada's home, he felt a quiet shift taking place. For the first time, he could see that all those years of independence, of pushing everyone away, had come at a cost. It had worn him down in ways he hadn't fully understood until now, leaving him carrying a weight he didn't know he was allowed to set down. Lost in thought, he barely noticed Yamada standing in the doorway, a curious expression on his face. Hey, Bakugou, Yamada greeted, stepping inside. Mind if I join you? Bakugou gave a quick nod, not entirely surprised. Yamada had a way of appearing just when he needed someone to talk to, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. Yamada took a seat on the chair across from him, his posture relaxed, inviting conversation without pressing for it. You look like you've got something on your mind, Yamada said gently, his tone open and understanding. Bakugou hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. Just thinking, he replied, his voice low. About everything. The way I used to handle things. I always thought I had to do it alone, that if I didn't, I'd look weak. That's how it's always been. Yamada nodded, his expression thoughtful. I get that. Sometimes, it feels like we have to keep up that image, that we have to prove we're strong enough to handle anything on our own. But the truth is, no one's meant to carry everything alone. Even heroes need support, people they can lean on. Bakugou looked up, meeting Yamada's gaze, searching for any hint of pity or judgment. But there was none, only quiet understanding and respect, a recognition of the strength it took to carry that weight for so long. "I don't regret it, though," Bakugou said, a hint of defiance in his tone. "Doing it alone. It made me who I am." Yamada nodded again, acknowledging his words with a gentle smile. "Of course. Everything you've been through, every challenge you've faced alone, that's all part of what makes you so strong. And that strength isn't going anywhere. But just because you're strong doesn't mean you have to keep going the same way." Bakugou frowned, considering the words carefully. He had always taken pride in his resilience, his ability to rise to any challenge on his own. But for the first time, he felt a subtle shift, a sense that he didn't have to lose that part of himself to move forward. What if I start depending on people and it changes me?" he asked quietly, almost afraid to voice the thought. "What if I lose that edge, that drive?" Yamada's smile softened, and he leaned forward, his voice filled with sincerity. "You're not going to lose that edge, Bakugou. You're still you, no matter who's beside you. Letting people in, accepting support, that's not weakness, it's a way of adding to your strength. It's about knowing that you don't have to carry every burden alone." The words settled over Bakugou like a blanket, warm and reassuring. He realized that Yamada wasn't asking him to change, to give up his independence or his strength. Instead, he was being offered a chance to expand that strength, to explore what it meant to be part of something greater without sacrificing his identity. After a moment, Bakugou looked away, his expression softening. "It's hard to think like that. I'm used to just handling things myself." Yamada nodded, his gaze steady. "And that self-reliance is an amazing quality, Bakugou. But you don't have to let it define every part of you. Strength can be versatile. It can grow in ways you never expected when you're open to different paths." Bakugou took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to hold on to his past while embracing a new approach. The path he had chosen, the one built on independence and resilience, had served him well. But perhaps now, it was time to try something different, to see if there was room in his life for both strength and connection. He gave Yamada a quick nod, his voice quiet but resolved. "I'll think about it." Yamada's smile widened, pride shining in his eyes. "That's all I ask, Bakugou. Just remember, you're not letting go of your past or your strength. You're building on it. And no matter what, we're here to help you along the way." As Yamada stood up to leave, Bakugou felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a quiet sense of acceptance settling in his heart. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to explore a new path, one that allowed him to be both strong and connected. And as he sat alone in the quiet room, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to let go of who he was to become who he wanted to be. The next day, Bakugou arrived at the training ground, feeling a familiar surge of determination. He was ready to tackle whatever challenge Aizawa and Yamada had prepared for him, but as he approached, he noticed that other students had joined them, Kirishima, Todoroki, and even Midoriya, who was stretching on the far side of the room. Bakugou's scowl deepened as he took in the scene, his irritation flaring. He had expected a solo session, a chance to push himself without distractions. Working with others wasn't part of his usual approach, and the thought of having to coordinate with them made his fists clench. Aizawa noticed his reaction and gave him a calm, level look. "Today's focus is on teamwork. We're running drills that require everyone to work together, balancing each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses." Bakugou let out a frustrated sigh, crossing his arms. "I don't need anyone to cover for me. I can handle whatever's thrown my way on my own." Yamada stepped forward, his tone light but firm. "We know you can, Bakugou. But this isn't about handling things on your own, it's about learning to integrate your abilities with others. Being able to rely on teammates can make you an even stronger hero." Bakugou bristled but nodded, a flicker of curiosity sparking beneath his resistance. He had been making an effort to open up, to test the boundaries of trust, and perhaps this was another opportunity to push himself in a new way. He'd try it, even if only to prove that he didn't need anyone's help. They started the drills with a simple exercise. Each team was tasked with navigating a series of obstacles, with specific roles assigned to each member. Bakugou was paired with Kirishima and Midoriya, his instinct to take charge, conflicting with the structure of the exercise. He clenched his jaw as they began, feeling the tension build. He was used to leading, to directing the flow of a battle, but here, he had to work within a team dynamic. Kirishima took the lead on defense, while Midoriya focused on strategizing their path through the obstacles. At first, Bakugou tried to charge ahead, his need for control pushing him to take over the exercise. But his impatience nearly caused him to trip up when he misjudged the timing of Kirishima's defensive move. He stumbled, frustration simmering as he adjusted his stance. "Bakugou, wait!" Midoriya called out, his voice urgent but steady. "If we go together, we can get through faster." Bakugou gritted his teeth, biting back a retort. He didn't want to admit it, but Midoriya's suggestion made sense. The obstacles required coordination, and if he kept rushing ahead, they'd only end up slowing each other down. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to nod in reluctant agreement. "Fine," he muttered, his tone clipped. "Let's try it your way." They continued, this time moving in sync. Kirishima covered them as they advanced, his defensive maneuvers absorbing the impact of each obstacle. Midoriya called out directions, guiding them through with calculated precision, while Bakugou used his quirk to clear obstacles in their path. To his surprise, the teamwork began to feel natural. There was a rhythm to it, a sense of flow that he hadn't expected. Working together didn't make him feel weaker, if anything, it heightened his awareness, allowing him to focus his energy on precise movements rather than brute force. As they reached the end of the drill, Bakugou found himself breathing hard, but there was a faint smile on his face, one he quickly tried to hide. He felt a sense of accomplishment, not just from completing the exercise, but from doing it alongside his classmates, each of them contributing in their own way. Yamada approached them, clapping his hands with a grin. "Nice work, everyone. You all coordinated perfectly, especially you, Bakugou. Great job letting others step in when needed." Bakugou crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "Don't get used to it," he muttered, though there was no real heat in his voice. Aizawa gave him a nod of approval. "You adapted well. That's an important skill for any hero, to recognize when teamwork can be an advantage." Bakugou nodded, feeling a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't expected to enjoy the exercise, let alone feel a sense of camaraderie with the others. The teamwork hadn't taken away from his strength, it had amplified it, allowing him to conserve his energy while still achieving his goal. As he looked around at his classmates, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was value in this idea of shared strength. It was a different kind of power, one that didn't threaten his independence, but instead complemented it, showing him a new path to growth. And for the first time, he felt a sense of satisfaction in knowing that he didn't have to be the lone force pushing forward. He could work with others, lean on them when needed, and still be every bit as strong as he had always been. After the training session wrapped up, Bakugou lingered behind as the other students left, each of them chatting about the exercises and their performance. He watched them go, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. The teamwork exercise hadn't dulled his edge as he'd feared. Instead, he felt sharper, more focused, his abilities enhanced by the trust and coordination they'd shared. Aizawa approached him, his expression thoughtful. "You handled that well, Bakugou. I could tell it wasn't easy for you at first." Bakugou shrugged, glancing away. "I just adjusted. It made sense to work together." Aizawa nodded, giving him a small, approving smile. "Exactly. Adapting your strengths to work within a team shows maturity. It doesn't mean giving up control, it means knowing when to share it, when to let others contribute so that you can focus on what you do best. Bakugou let the words sink in, feeling a quiet sense of pride well up within him. He hadn't thought of teamwork as something that could amplify his skills, but today's training had shown him otherwise. He could be strong on his own, but with the right team, he could be even stronger, more precise, more effective. It's weird, Bakugou admitted after a moment. I didn't think I'd enjoy it. Working with others. I always thought it'd just slow me down. Aizawa's gaze softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on Bakugou's shoulder. Teamwork doesn't mean sacrificing your identity, Bakugou. It's a skill, just like anything else, and you're mastering it. You're learning to balance independence with trust, and that's no small feat. Bakugou met his gaze, surprised by the pride he saw in Aizawa's eyes. He wasn't used to hearing this kind of affirmation, this acknowledgement of his growth. Most of his life, he'd been praised for his strength, his power, but rarely for his adaptability or his willingness to change. It doesn't mean I'll rely on them all the time, Bakugou said, his tone quieter than usual. But, it's good to know I can, if I need to. Aizawa's expression softened further, his voice filled with sincerity. Exactly. True strength isn't about refusing help, it's about knowing when to accept it, to integrate it into your own abilities. You've got that strength, Bakugou. You've had it all along, but now you're learning to use it in new ways. The word struck a chord deep within Bakugou, filling him with a newfound sense of pride. He had always viewed teamwork as something that required him to hold back, to compromise, but now he could see it as an extension of his own strength, a way to push beyond his limits. Thanks, Sensei, he muttered, his voice gruff, but sincere. For everything. Aizawa gave him a small nod, his gaze steady. You've come a long way, Bakugou. Don't forget to take pride in that. You're finding your own balance, and that's something worth celebrating. Bakugou nodded, feeling a warmth settle over him, a sense of pride, not just in his strength, but in his growth, in the journey he was on. He wasn't abandoning his independence, he was expanding it, learning to draw strength from those around him without losing himself. As they left the training room, Bakugou felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet certainty that he was on the right path. He didn't have to be alone to be strong, and he didn't have to sacrifice his identity to work with others. And for the first time, he felt truly proud of the progress he was making, knowing that he could build a future that honored both his independence and his connections. Chapter 8. It was late evening, and the apartment was quiet. Bakugou had finished his homework, but felt restless, his mind buzzing with thoughts he couldn't quite shake. Training had been intense lately, and the pressure he put on himself was beginning to weigh heavily. Despite the strides he'd made in connecting with Aizawa and Yamada, there was a lingering sense of unease, a nagging voice that reminded him he still had something to prove. Unable to sit still, he wandered into the living room, where Aizawa was seated with a book, his expression calm and relaxed. Bakugou hesitated, feeling an urge to talk, but uncertain if he wanted to share the thoughts swirling in his mind. Aizawa glanced up, noticing Bakugou's restlessness. Can't sleep? He asked, closing his book and setting it aside. Bakugou shrugged, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. Just, a lot on my mind, he muttered. Aizawa nodded, gesturing for him to take a seat. Want to talk about it? Bakugou hesitated, but there was a quiet, non-judgmental invitation in Aizawa's gaze that made it easier to speak. He sank into the chair across from Aizawa, feeling the weight of his thoughts settle over him. I keep feeling like I need to be better, he began, his voice low. Like, no matter how hard I push myself, it's not enough. There's always someone stronger, always something else to prove. And he trailed off, struggling to find the right words. Aizawa watched him with a steady, calm gaze, his expression thoughtful. It's exhausting, he finished gently, as if he could see right through the armor Bakugou tried to keep up. Bakugou nodded, his jaw clenched. Yeah. It's like I have to keep proving I deserve to be here, to be as strong as everyone expects me to be. Aizawa leaned forward, his voice filled with understanding. Bakugou, strength doesn't come from constantly pushing yourself to the limit. It comes from recognizing your worth, from understanding that you don't need to be perfect to be valuable. You're already enough. The words hit Bakugou harder than he expected. He'd spent so long believing that his worth was tied to his achievements, that he had to prove himself through sheer force of will. Hearing Aizawa say he was enough felt foreign, almost impossible to believe. But if I don't push myself, then what? He asked quietly, a hint of vulnerability slipping into his voice. I'm supposed to be strong. If I'm not constantly working, I'll fall behind. Aizawa gave him a gentle, reassuring smile. Strength isn't just about physical power or endless progress. It's about resilience, balance, and the ability to recognize when you need to take a step back. You have incredible drive, Bakugou, and that's admirable. But there's a difference between pushing yourself and punishing yourself. Bakugou's gaze fell to the floor, his fists clenched as he processed Aizawa's words. He had always viewed his drive as a necessity, a non-negotiable part of his identity. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry the weight of his ambitions alone. Maybe he could find strength and balance, in knowing when to lean on others. Sometimes, I wonder if I'm doing enough, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Like, everyone expects me to be this strong, unbreakable person. And if I let anyone down, it feels like I'm letting myself down too. Aizawa's gaze softened, and he reached out, placing a steady hand on Bakugou's shoulder. Bakugou, it's okay to have doubts. Every hero does. But don't let those doubts define you. You're already making progress, already growing in ways that are beyond just strength or skill. You're learning to be part of something bigger, to find support without losing who you are. Bakugou looked up, meeting Aizawa's gaze, and felt a flicker of gratitude. It was rare for him to feel truly seen, to have someone understand the pressure he carried without dismissing it. Aizawa wasn't asking him to change, he was simply offering a new perspective, one that allowed room for growth without sacrificing his identity. Thanks, sensei, he muttered, feeling a warmth settle over him. It helps. Hearing that. Aizawa nodded, his expression filled with quiet pride. You're stronger than you realize, Bakugou. And you're not alone in this. We're here for you, no matter what. Bakugou let the words sink in, feeling a quiet sense of reassurance that he wasn't used to. The weight of his ambition still lingered, but it felt lighter now, more manageable. He could still strive to be the best, still push himself, but he didn't have to do it all alone. He didn't have to carry the burden without support. As he stood to leave, he glanced back at Aizawa, his voice softer. I'll keep that in mind. Aizawa gave him a small nod, his gaze steady. Take it one day at a time, Bakugou. You're already on the right path. Bakugou returned to his room with a renewed sense of purpose, his heart lighter and his mind calmer. He was beginning to understand that he could be strong without sacrificing his well-being, that he could embrace his ambitions while allowing himself moments of rest and support. For the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that he didn't have to face everything alone. And as he lay down, he allowed himself to believe, even if just a little, that he was enough. The following day, Bakugou wandered into the kitchen, the smell of coffee and fresh toast filling the air. Yamada was seated at the table, flipping through a magazine, his usual bright energy softened by the morning quiet. Bakugou poured himself a glass of water, unsure of why he felt compelled to linger, but something about the easy atmosphere kept him there. Yamada looked up, a smile spreading across his face. Morning, Bakugou. How'd you sleep? Bakugou shrugged, taking a sip of water. Fine, I guess. Just thinking about a lot of stuff. Yamada's gaze grew gentle, an understanding glimmer in his eyes. I get it. Things have been pretty intense lately. You've been putting in a lot of work. Bakugou nodded, feeling a bit self-conscious. Yeah, trying to keep up. Yamada tilted his head, studying Bakugou with a thoughtful expression. You know, I wasn't always the smooth-talking, ultra-confident guy you see today, he said with a small laugh. Bakugou raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. Seriously? Yamada grinned, a hint of nostalgia in his eyes. Oh yeah. Back in my school days, I used to struggle with feeling like I didn't belong. I wanted so badly to be noticed, to be seen as strong and capable, but I didn't feel like I measured up to everyone else. I kept pushing myself, thinking that if I just tried harder, maybe I'd finally be good enough. Bakugou's curiosity stirred. He had always assumed Yamada was naturally outgoing, always confident and assured. The idea of Yamada ever struggling with self-doubt felt almost unreal. What happened? Bakugou asked, genuinely intrigued. Yamada's expression softened, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. Eventually, I realized that trying to prove myself to everyone else was exhausting me. I was so focused on what others thought that I lost sight of who I was. But then, a friend, someone I really trusted, helped me see that I didn't need to change to be valuable. I just needed to accept myself and trust the people who cared about me. Bakugou listened, the story hitting closer to home than he expected. He understood the pressure to prove oneself, the weight of expectations that made every moment feel like a test. But hearing Yamada's experience, his journey toward self-acceptance, made Bakugou feel a strange sense of kinship, as if Yamada truly understood the struggles he carried. Must have been tough, Bakugou muttered, glancing away. Letting go of all that. Yamada nodded, a gentle smile on his face. It was. But once I did, everything became easier. I learned that I could still push myself, still aim for greatness, but I didn't have to do it alone. And that's made all the difference. Bakugou felt the words resonate within him, a quiet reassurance settling in his chest. It was comforting to know that he wasn't alone in feeling this way, that someone he respected had faced similar struggles and come out stronger for it. Yamada's openness made him feel understood, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider that maybe he could find a similar balance. Guess that makes sense, he said, his tone softer. It's just hard, you know? Letting people in. Trusting that they won't let you down. Yamada's eyes softened, and he nodded. I know, Bakugou. But you're not alone in this. Aizawa and I are here for you, and we're not going anywhere. You can rely on us, we want to be there for you, to help you grow without feeling like you have to carry everything by yourself. Bakugou looked down, feeling a surge of gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. Yamada's support, his willingness to share a piece of his own past, made Bakugou feel like he was part of something greater, like he was truly welcome in this home. Thanks, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. For sharing that. Yamada smiled, giving him a friendly nudge on the shoulder. Anytime, Bakugou. We're family now, remember? We've got each other's backs. Bakugou felt a warmth spread through him at the word family. It was a new feeling, one he hadn't quite come to terms with, but he allowed himself to lean into it, to trust in the bond he was building here. As he left the kitchen, he realized that Yamada's support had given him more than just encouragement, it had given him a sense of belonging, a quiet assurance that he didn't have to face every challenge alone. And for the first time, he felt like he could embrace that connection without losing himself. Later that evening, Bakugou found himself pacing around his room, thoughts swirling as he replayed the conversations he'd had with Aizawa and Yamada. Their words had touched something deep within him, a part of himself he rarely let others see. The encouragement, the understanding, it had left him feeling both grateful and unsettled, as if he owed them something he couldn't quite define. He hated the feeling of being in debt to anyone, even if it was just emotional. But this wasn't about proving himself or repaying a favor, it was something different. It was a way of saying thank you, of showing that he valued what they'd done for him. As he mulled it over, an idea formed, and he made his way to the kitchen with quiet determination. After rummaging through the cabinets, he found what he was looking for, a few simple ingredients for a meal. Cooking wasn't something he did often, but he remembered some of his mother's recipes, dishes he had learned out of a stubborn sense of independence. He figured he'd put those skills to use now, as a way of showing his gratitude in his own way. As he chopped vegetables and prepared the stovetop, he kept his movements focused, putting the same intensity into this task as he would in training. The rhythmic chopping, the quiet sizzle of the pan, it was almost meditative, calming in a way he hadn't expected. He worked in silence, his mind surprisingly clear. This wasn't about showing off or proving anything, it was simply about creating something, about offering a piece of himself without words. The meal was simple, nothing fancy, just a stir-fry with rice and a side of steamed vegetables, but it felt like enough. It felt like a piece of himself that he was willing to share. As he finished plating the dishes, he heard footsteps approaching, and he looked up to see Aizawa and Yamada standing in the doorway, both of them watching him with a mixture of curiosity and warmth. "What's all this?" Yamada asked, his smile wide and genuine. Bakugou shrugged, trying to keep his tone casual. "Just figured I'd make something. Since you guys are always helping me out and stuff." Aizawa's expression softened, and he exchanged a glance with Yamada before stepping forward. "Thank you, Bakugou. This means a lot." Bakugou looked away, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "It's no big deal. Just figured it was time I did something useful around here." They sat down at the table together, and Bakugou watched as Aizawa and Yamada took their first bites, his heart pounding slightly as he waited for their reaction. He hadn't expected to feel so nervous, but their approval, even in something as small as a meal, felt important. Yamada's eyes lit up, and he gave Bakugou a thumbs up. "This is awesome, Bakugou. You've got some serious skills in the kitchen." Aizawa nodded, his gaze filled with quiet pride. "It's excellent. Thank you for this." Bakugou felt a surge of satisfaction, his tension easing as he saw the appreciation in their eyes. It wasn't about the food itself, it was about the gesture, the meaning behind it. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel pride in something other than strength or skill. This was something different, something that came from a place of connection, of wanting to give back in his own way. As they continued eating, the conversation flowed easily, laughter and stories filling the space around them. Bakugou felt himself relaxing, the walls he usually kept up slipping away in the warmth of their shared meal. It felt natural, comfortable, a moment of genuine belonging that he hadn't realized he'd been craving. By the time they finished, Bakugou felt a quiet sense of contentment, a warmth that lingered long after the last plate had been cleared. He hadn't expected to feel so at home, so connected, but this simple act had helped him realize that he didn't have to keep himself at a distance. He could be a part of this family, could offer his own strengths and contributions without fear of losing himself. As he stood up to clear the table, Yamada gave him a gentle pat on the back, his voice filled with pride. "You're one of us, Bakugou. You know that, right?" Bakugou nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah," he said quietly, feeling the truth of it settle in his heart. "I think I do." And for the first time, he felt a true sense of peace, knowing that he was exactly where he needed to be. Chapter 9. Bakugou stomped into the apartment, his jaw clenched and his fists tight at his sides. Training had been brutal today, and a particular exercise had thrown him off balance more times than he cared to count. He could feel the frustration simmering, the weight of his own expectations pressing down on him like a lead weight. He dropped his bag by the door, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could improve, how he needed to do better. But no matter how much he analyzed it, the failure stung, gnawing at him with a relentless persistence. As he entered the living room, he found Aizawa seated on the couch, grading papers with his usual calm focus. Aizawa looked up, his gaze immediately noticing Bakugou's tense posture and clenched fists. "Rough day?" he asked, his tone gentle but perceptive. Bakugou grunted, not in the mood to talk about it but feeling the weight of Aizawa's gaze. He stood there for a moment, caught between the impulse to brush it off and the sudden, unfamiliar urge to let it out. "Yeah," he muttered finally, crossing his arms. "Training didn't go the way I wanted." Aizawa set down his papers, giving Bakugou his full attention. "Want to talk about it?" Bakugou hesitated, his mind racing through the events of the day. He wasn't used to admitting frustration openly, especially not to someone he respected. But Aizawa's steady presence, his calm patience, made it easier to take a breath and let down his guard, if only a little. "I kept messing up," he said, his voice low, the words coming out more easily than he expected. "There's this new maneuver they want us to nail, and I just couldn't get it right. No matter how hard I tried, I kept slipping up." Aizawa nodded, his expression thoughtful, but without a hint of judgment. "It sounds like you're pushing yourself hard. That's not a bad thing, but sometimes, that pressure can work against you." Bakugou clenched his fists, frustration still simmering beneath the surface. "I have to push myself. If I don't, then what's the point? I'm supposed to be better than this." Aizawa's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and reassuring. "Bakugou, setbacks don't define your worth. Even the best heroes stumble, even the strongest have moments where things don't go as planned. It's part of the process, part of growth." Bakugou looked away, feeling a pang of vulnerability that made him want to retreat. But Aizawa's words resonated with him, a reminder that he didn't have to carry the weight of perfection alone. "I just hate messing up," he admitted quietly. "Feels like I'm letting myself down." Aizawa gave a small nod of understanding. "I know that feeling. But you don't have to be perfect to be strong. Strength is about resilience, about how you handle those moments when things don't go perfectly. And resilience isn't built on perfection, it's built on persistence, on learning from every stumble." The words settled over Bakugou, softening the frustration that had been weighing him down. He wasn't used to hearing this kind of encouragement, this reassurance that allowed room for mistakes, for setbacks, without diminishing his strength. "Guess I'll try again tomorrow," he muttered, his tone reluctant but genuine. Aizawa's gaze held a hint of pride. "That's the spirit. One day at a time, Bakugou. You're already making progress just by pushing through. Remember, strength is as much about patience as it is about power." Bakugou nodded, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. The frustration was still there, but it felt less overwhelming, less defining. Aizawa's words had given him something he hadn't realized he needed, a sense of validation, a reminder that he could be strong even in moments of imperfection. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Aizawa, a hint of gratitude in his gaze. "Thanks for listening." Aizawa gave him a small nod, his expression warm. "Anytime, Bakugou. You don't have to face it alone." Bakugou returned to his room with a quieter mind, the weight of the day's frustrations softened by the simple act of sharing them. He was beginning to understand that vulnerability didn't make him weaker, it allowed him to clear the doubts and refocus, to find strength in knowing he wasn't carrying everything alone. And as he prepared for the next day, he felt a renewed determination, a resolve grounded not just in ambition, but in the quiet assurance that he had a support system ready to catch him if he stumbled. After his conversation with Aizawa, Bakugou felt somewhat lighter, but a hint of frustration still lingered. He had pushed himself hard, and though Aizawa's words had given him perspective, he couldn't quite shake the feeling of needing to prove himself. Yamada entered the living room just as Bakugou was considering heading to his room to blow off some steam alone. He noticed the tension in Bakugou's expression and shot him a quick, concerned look. "Hey, Bakugou," Yamada greeted, his voice bright but gentle. "Rough day?" Bakugou gave a slight nod, not quite ready to dive back into the whole story. Yeah, just a lot of training stuff. Yamada's expression softened, and he nodded in understanding. How about taking a little break? Sometimes, the best way to clear your mind is to do something fun, something that doesn't require so much focus. Bakugou raised an eyebrow, intrigued, despite himself. Like what? Yamada grinned, a mischievous sparkle in his eyes. Music. Got a couple of tracks I've been meaning to listen to, thought maybe you'd join me. Or, he added with a shrug, we could go for a quick walk. Anything to shake things up a bit. Bakugou hesitated, feeling the pull between his natural instinct to isolate and the unfamiliar but tempting offer to unwind with Yamada. Eventually, he gave a quick nod. Fine. The walk might help. Yamada's grin widened, and he motioned for Bakugou to follow him. They stepped outside, the cool evening air refreshing against Bakugou's skin. They walked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the sounds of the city filling the quiet between them. Bakugou felt himself relax slightly, the fresh air and easy pace helping to ease the tension he'd been carrying. After a while, Yamada glanced over, his expression thoughtful. You know, back when I was just starting out as a hero, I used to get frustrated a lot too. Felt like I had to keep proving myself, always pushing harder and harder. Bakugou glanced at him, surprised by the admission. He rarely thought of Yamada as someone who struggled with self-doubt, but hearing it now made him feel a little less alone in his own challenges. What changed? He asked, his curiosity piqued. Yamada shrugged, his tone light. A friend reminded me that sometimes, we're our own toughest critics. We push ourselves so hard because we think that's the only way to be strong. But real strength is knowing when to take a step back, when to let yourself recharge. Bakugou absorbed the words, feeling the truth of them settle into his mind. He'd always equated strength with relentless drive, with never stopping, never slowing down. But here, walking alongside Yamada, he could feel a different kind of strength, a quiet resilience that didn't come from pushing harder, but from allowing himself moments of rest. They walked a bit further, the tension slowly easing from Bakugou's shoulders. The simple act of being out here, surrounded by the hum of the city, with Yamada's easygoing presence beside him, made the day's frustrations feel less overwhelming. After a while, Yamada gave him a nudge, his voice warm. Remember, Bakugou, you're not in this alone. Sometimes, a little break can make all the difference. You don't always have to carry everything on your own. Bakugou nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Yeah. Guess you're right. Yamada grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. That's the spirit. You've got this, Bakugou. And anytime you need a break, we're here for you. As they headed back to the apartment, Bakugou felt a renewed sense of calm. The walk had helped clear his mind, and Yamada's understanding had reminded him that he didn't have to shoulder everything alone. He could trust in the support around him, could allow himself moments of vulnerability without losing his strength. For the first time, he felt a quiet sense of relief in knowing he had people beside him who understood, who supported him no matter what. Later that evening, Bakugou found himself sitting by the window in his room, the city lights casting a soft glow through the glass. The apartment was quiet, Aizawa and Yamada having turned in for the night, and for the first time in a while, Bakugou felt a calmness that wasn't tied to exhaustion or sheer willpower. The day's events lingered in his mind, the training session that hadn't gone as planned, the frustration that had boiled over, and the conversations with Aizawa and Yamada. Their support had felt steady, unwavering, giving him something solid to lean on even as he struggled. They hadn't demanded perfection from him, instead, they'd reminded him that strength wasn't about never faltering, but about learning to get back up. He took a deep breath, the quiet settling into his bones. For so long, he had carried his ambitions and expectations on his own, refusing to let anyone see the doubts and insecurities beneath his confident exterior. But here, with Aizawa and Yamada, he had been allowed to let those walls down, to experience vulnerability without fear of judgment. As he reflected, he realized something that had been quietly building within him, a trust not only in Aizawa and Yamada, but in himself. Trust that he could face setbacks without letting them define him. Trust that he was strong enough to admit when he needed support. And, perhaps most importantly, trust that he was worthy of the care and understanding they had shown him. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of pride in his own growth, a pride that came not from achievement, but from the willingness to try something new, to embrace a different kind of strength. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment as he let himself simply be. The pressure he often felt, the relentless drive to prove himself, felt less pressing, less defining. He was beginning to understand that he didn't have to choose between independence and connection, he could have both, could balance his fierce determination with the quiet resilience that came from trusting in his support system. As he opened his eyes and glanced around the room, a faint smile crossed his face. He knew he still had a long way to go, that there would be other days filled with frustration and doubt. But he also knew that he wasn't alone, that he had people in his life who would stand by him, who would remind him of his worth even when he struggled to see it himself. "Guess I'm doing all right," he murmured to himself, a quiet pride coloring his voice. The words felt like a small victory, a testament to the progress he'd made. For the first time, he felt like he could trust in his own journey, in the steps he was taking to grow not just as a hero, but as a person. And as he settled into bed that night, he carried that trust with him, feeling more at peace than he had in a long time. He drifted off to sleep with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing he had the strength within himself and the support around him to keep moving forward. Chapter 10. Bakugou took a deep breath, steadying himself as he prepared to try the maneuver once more. He had been working on it for days, each attempt bringing him closer but never quite hitting the mark. But today, something felt different. He wasn't just going through the motions, he was focused, grounded, and, more importantly, he felt ready. He glanced over to where Aizawa and Yamada were observing from the sidelines, both of them watching with quiet encouragement. Their presence was steadying, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this journey, that he had support, no matter the outcome. With a surge of determination, Bakugou launched into the maneuver, his movements sharp and precise. Each step flowed into the next, his body moving with a control and fluidity that felt natural, effortless. As he reached the end, he landed perfectly, not a single misstep in his execution. For a moment, he stood there, catching his breath as the reality of his success sank in. He'd done it, after all the effort, the frustration, and the countless attempts, he'd finally nailed the technique. A grin spread across his face, the satisfaction filling him with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't just about proving something, it was about recognizing his own growth, about feeling the progress he'd made with every attempt. Aizawa and Yamada approached him, both of them smiling. Yamada clapped him on the back, his grin wide and genuine. "Nice work, Bakugou. That was perfect. I knew you had it in you." Aizawa nodded, a faint smile on his usually stoic face. "Well done. You've made real progress." Bakugou's grin widened, a sense of pride warming his chest. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully enjoy the victory, to take pride in his accomplishment without downplaying it or brushing it off. He'd earned this, and he was willing to share that feeling openly with Aizawa and Yamada. "Yeah," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Guess all that practice paid off." Yamada chuckled, his eyes crinkling with pride. "See? You didn't have to carry it all alone. It's about balance, and you found that. That's real growth, Bakugou." Bakugou looked down, feeling a bit bashful under the praise, but not shying away from it. He met their eyes, his expression sincere. "Thanks for sticking with me. I didn't make it easy, but you guys, you didn't give up." Aizawa's gaze softened, and he placed a steady hand on Bakugou's shoulder. "You've worked hard, Bakugou. This victory is yours. Own it." Bakugou nodded, feeling a quiet sense of pride settle over him. This wasn't about showing off or proving himself to others, it was about proving something to himself, about recognizing that he was capable, that he could rise to the challenge and succeed. As he left the training room, he felt lighter, his confidence stronger. This victory, small as it might seem, was a testament to his growth, to the journey he'd embraced with Aizawa and Yamada's support. And for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to prove anything to anyone but himself. The next day, Bakugou was in the training arena with a few of his classmates, running through exercises in pairs. Each group focused on building coordination and applying new maneuvers, and Bakugou had just finished a round when he noticed Kirishima, who was working solo on a difficult drill. Kirishima's usual confident smile was missing, his face set in a look of focused frustration as he struggled with his technique. Bakugou watched for a moment, recognizing the telltale signs of someone pushing themselves too hard. He knew that feeling all too well, the urge to succeed, the frustration of falling short, and the tension that built up when things didn't go as planned. Without overthinking it, Bakugou strode over to Kirishima, his voice gruff, but laced with the slightest hint of concern. "Oi, Kirishima. You're tensing up too much. You're forcing the move instead of letting it flow." Kirishima looked up, surprise flashing across his face. He blinked, then gave Bakugou a sheepish smile. "Oh, hey, Bakugou. Yeah, I guess I'm kinda stuck. I keep trying, but I just can't seem to get it right." Bakugou rolled his eyes, though there was no real annoyance behind the gesture. "You're putting too much pressure on yourself. Relax a little, and don't overthink it. Sometimes, stepping back for a second can help." Kirishima took a deep breath, nodding as he absorbed Bakugou's advice. "Alright. I'll give it a shot. Thanks, man." Bakugou stepped back, watching as Kirishima reset his stance, his movements a bit looser this time. Kirishima tried the maneuver again, this time approaching it with a calmer focus, and while he didn't perfect it, there was a noticeable improvement. When he finished, he turned to Bakugou, his face breaking into a grateful grin. "That helped a lot. I was getting in my own head there, but what you said really made a difference. I appreciate it, Bakugou." Bakugou shrugged, trying to play it off. "Don't get all mushy about it. Just thought I'd save you from wasting time." But despite his words, he felt a surprising warmth from the exchange, a quiet satisfaction in having been able to support Kirishima in his own small way. For so long, he thought that helping others meant compromising his own strength or focus, but now he could see that sharing his insights, offering encouragement, actually made him feel stronger. It didn't take away from him, it added to him. As they continued with the session, Bakugou found himself more aware of his classmates' progress, noticing the small improvements they made, the way they each supported one another. He saw Midoriya helping Todoroki with a technique, Uraraka offering encouragement to Ishido, and the subtle but powerful effect that came from shared strength and mutual support. By the end of the session, Bakugou felt a deeper appreciation for the bonds he had with his classmates, the quiet resilience that came from working together. He didn't need to be the sole focus, didn't have to prove himself by standing apart. His strength, his growth, was just as valuable when it was shared, when it became part of something larger. As they all left the training room, Kirishima jogged up beside him, giving him a friendly pat on the back. "Seriously, thanks again, Bakugou. I wouldn't have gotten through that without your help." Bakugou smirked, brushing off the praise, but allowing himself to feel a small sense of pride. "Just keep working on it. You'll get there." As he walked back toward the locker room, Bakugou felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He'd learned that supporting others, sharing his knowledge, didn't take away from his own strength, it amplified it, gave it purpose beyond just himself. And for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, this was the kind of strength he'd been looking for all along. Later that evening, Bakugou found himself standing by his window, gazing out over the city. The quiet of the night brought a sense of calm that matched the reflection settling over him. Today had been a good day, a day where he'd not only met his own goals, but had also been able to support Kurashima and feel pride in his friend's progress. It was a different kind of satisfaction, one that came from realizing that his growth was both personal and shared. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories of the past few months wash over him. From the early days of constant frustration and resistance, to the small victories he'd learned to celebrate, to the trust he'd started to build with Aizawa and Yamada, it felt like he'd come a long way. It wasn't just about the techniques or the training, it was about finding a new balance, about learning that he could trust others and still remain strong. He thought back to all the times he'd stubbornly refused help, convinced that accepting it would make him weak. But Aizawa and Yamada had shown him that strength could mean something different, something deeper. They hadn't tried to change him, they'd simply supported him, giving him the space to grow at his own pace. And in doing so, they'd helped him become a stronger, more resilient version of himself. He opened his eyes, a quiet sense of pride settling over him. He'd faced his struggles head-on, had embraced vulnerability, had learned to see trust as an extension of his strength rather than a threat to it. He no longer felt the weight of needing to prove himself to anyone but himself, and that realization filled him with a calm confidence he hadn't felt before. As he continued to look out over the city, he thought of Aizawa and Yamada, the trust they'd placed in him, and the ways they'd guided him without ever pushing. A small smile crossed his face as he acknowledged the gratitude he felt for them, for the family they'd become, and the support they'd offered without expecting anything in return. Quietly, he made a mental note to show them his appreciation, not with words, perhaps, but with actions. He would continue working hard, continue growing, not because he had something to prove, but because he wanted to honor the support they'd given him, to become someone they could be proud of. "Guess I'm doing all right," he murmured to himself, a faint smile lingering on his lips. In that moment, he felt truly at peace. His journey was far from over, and there would be more challenges, more frustrations, and more days where he'd struggle. But he knew now that he didn't have to face it all alone. He could find strength in his connections, in the family he'd built here, and in the balance he'd learned to embrace. As he turned away from the window, he carried that sense of purpose and pride with him, feeling ready to face whatever came next. For the first time, he knew that his path wasn't defined by perfection or by isolation, it was defined by growth, by resilience, and by the unwavering support of those who believed in him. And with that, he finally felt at home. Chapter 11. The training room was filled with various obstacle setups, each more challenging than the last. Today's exercise was designed to test coordination, resilience, and the ability to adapt in high-pressure situations. Bakugou was used to training solo or with classmates, but today, he was paired with Aizawa and Yamada, a scenario that made him both curious and determined. Aizawa explained the drill with his usual calm demeanor. "Our goal is to reach the endpoint without setting off any of the sensors. The exercise isn't just about speed, it's about precision and timing." Yamada grinned, his energy infectious. "And remember, teamwork is key. We're all in this together." Bakugou nodded, already calculating their approach. He could feel a familiar surge of focus, the kind that made him eager to take on any challenge. But there was something different today, a sense of trust, a knowledge that he didn't have to carry everything on his own. They moved into formation, Aizawa taking the lead as they navigated the first few obstacles. Bakugou followed closely, watching Aizawa's careful steps and mimicking his movements to avoid the sensors. Yamada brought up the rear, his pace steady as he kept an eye on both of them. At one point, they reached a section filled with laser grids that required precise timing to get through. Aizawa glanced back at Bakugou, his voice low but reassuring. "We'll take this slow. Trust each other's movements, and don't rush." Bakugou nodded, focusing on Aizawa's lead as they began to maneuver through the lasers. It took every ounce of patience and precision he had, but with Aizawa's steady guidance and Yamada's encouragement, they cleared the section without triggering any sensors. They were nearing the end when an unexpected obstacle emerged, a shifting floor that tilted unpredictably. Bakugou's instinct was to charge forward, but he caught himself, remembering Aizawa's advice to stay coordinated. He looked back, catching Yamada's eye. "Go left, and keep your balance," Bakugou called out, feeling a strange sense of responsibility for guiding them through. They followed his lead, adjusting their movements to the shifting floor. It was a tense, slow process, but Bakugou found himself trusting their combined effort, relying on Aizawa's calm presence and Yamada's unwavering support. The trust he felt in them was new but deeply grounding, a reminder that he didn't have to face every challenge alone. When they finally reached the end point, Bakugou let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They'd done it, together. Yamada clapped him on the shoulder, his grin wide. "That was awesome, Bakugou. You led us through that last part like a pro." Aizawa nodded, a rare but genuine smile on his face. "You adapted well. Your instincts are sharp, and you trusted the team. That's growth." Bakugou felt a surge of pride, not just in the accomplishment, but in the realization that he had relied on them, had let himself trust fully in their guidance and support. It was a different kind of strength, one that came from working as a unit, from knowing that they had each other's backs. "Guess it wasn't so bad working together," he muttered, trying to keep his tone casual. Yamada laughed, giving him a friendly nudge. "Teamwork looks good on you, Bakugou. You don't always have to carry the weight alone." As they left the training room, Bakugou felt a renewed sense of connection, a bond that had deepened through the shared challenge. He was starting to see that his strength didn't have to be solitary, that trusting others could enhance his own resilience, giving him the freedom to grow without feeling like he had to prove anything alone. And for the first time, he felt fully at ease with Aizawa and Yamada, knowing that they were more than just mentors, they were partners, friends, and family. Later that evening, Bakugou sat on the couch, a quiet sense of contentment settling over him after the successful training session. Aizawa entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea, and handed one to Bakugou before taking a seat beside him. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding that didn't require words. After a few moments, Aizawa glanced over, his expression thoughtful. "You did well today. I could see how much effort you put into adapting and trusting the team." Bakugou took a sip of his tea, his gaze focused on the floor. "Yeah, it wasn't easy, but it felt right." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to work with others like that. I always thought I had to do everything myself." Aizawa nodded, his gaze steady. "That's understandable. You're driven, focused. Those qualities have helped you get to where you are. But there's a difference between strength and isolation. Today, you showed strength in knowing when to trust others." Bakugou felt a flicker of pride, but a hint of doubt lingered. He stared into his mug, his voice barely above a whisper. What if I'm not enough? What if I let someone down? I'm supposed to be the best, but I'm still figuring things out." Aizawa's gaze softened, and he leaned forward, his voice calm and reassuring. "Being the best isn't about never making mistakes or never needing help. It's about learning, growing, and knowing your limits. You don't have to carry that weight alone, Bakugou. No one expects you to be perfect." Bakugou looked up, meeting Aizawa's gaze. For so long, he had driven himself forward with the belief that he had to be the strongest, that anything less was failure. But Aizawa's words made him feel something he hadn't felt before, a sense of acceptance, of being valued not just for his abilities but for who he was. "Sometimes, it feels like if I don't push myself, I'll just fade into the background," he admitted quietly. "I don't want to be weak. I don't want to let anyone down, especially not you and Yamada." Aizawa gave a slight smile, his gaze filled with warmth. "Bakugou, you're not letting anyone down. You're growing at your own pace, and that's exactly what we want for you. You're already enough. Trust in that." The words settled over Bakugou like a weight lifted, easing the tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. He allowed himself to feel the truth in Aizawa's statement, to let go of the need to prove something constantly. For the first time, he felt fully understood, seen not just as a student or a fighter, but as someone worthy of acceptance. "Thanks, sensei," he muttered, his voice soft but sincere. "For believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Aizawa placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Always, Bakugou. We're proud of the person you're becoming. And remember, you don't have to face it all alone." They sat in silence for a few more moments, the warmth of the tea and Aizawa's words filling the room with a quiet peace. Bakugou realized that this conversation, this connection, was more valuable than any training session, any victory. It was a reminder that he was valued, that he belonged, and that he was free to be himself without constantly needing to prove his worth. As they finished their tea, Bakugou felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet assurance that he was on the right path, not because he had to be perfect, but because he was growing, supported by people who believed in him unconditionally. The next evening, Bakugou found himself on the couch with Aizawa and Yamada. Yamada had declared it movie night and insisted on watching a classic action film. Bakugou had agreed, though he secretly thought he'd likely end up analyzing the fight scenes more than actually enjoying the film. As the movie started, Bakugou leaned back, his mind still buzzing from everything he'd learned and shared with Aizawa. But as the plot unfolded, he found himself easing into the atmosphere, his usual guardedness slipping away in the comfort of their presence. Yamada, as usual, was fully immersed, occasionally making commentary on the characters' ridiculous lines or exaggerated stunts. When a particularly over-the-top scene involving a high-speed car chase came on, Yamada leaned over with a wide grin. "See, Bakugou," he said, gesturing at the screen. "Even the best heroes need a team to back them up. No way this guy would pull off that stunt alone." Bakugou rolled his eyes, unable to stop the faint smirk on his face. "Yeah, maybe, but these guys wouldn't last 2 minutes in a real fight. All flash, no strategy." Aizawa raised an eyebrow, a rare playful glint in his eyes. "I'm starting to think you should direct the next movie, Bakugou. You've got all the critical feedback ready to go." Yamada burst into laughter, nudging Bakugou. "See? You've got talent outside of just fighting, you're already ready to take on the movie world." Bakugou snorted, his smirk turning into a real smile as he felt the warmth of their laughter around him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so at ease, so genuinely comfortable with letting his guard down. There was something freeing about sharing these small, simple moments with them, knowing he didn't have to be perfect or strong all the time. As the movie continued, Bakugou found himself laughing at Yamada's over-the-top reactions, occasionally throwing in his own sarcastic comments. The three of them shared easy banter, each playful jab or joke met with genuine laughter. It was a side of himself he rarely showed, a side that didn't need to prove anything, that could simply exist, supported by the trust and acceptance he felt with Aizawa and Yamada. When the credits finally rolled, Yamada stretched with a satisfied sigh. "Now that's what I call a movie night. Who's up for another one next week?" Bakugou rolled his eyes, but couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at his lips. "Fine. As long as the next one's not as ridiculous as this." Aizawa chuckled, giving Bakugou a knowing look. "I think you secretly enjoyed it. But don't worry, we'll pick something a little more strategic next time." Bakugou shrugged, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the movie. It was the feeling of being part of something, of belonging to a family that accepted him without expecting him to change. These moments, filled with laughter, ease, and simple joy, were becoming his new foundation, a reminder that he didn't have to face life alone. As they started clearing up, Yamada gave Bakugou a friendly nudge. "Glad you're with us, Bakugou. Wouldn't be the same without you." Bakugou looked down, his voice quiet but sincere. "Yeah, thanks. For all of this." Aizawa placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his expression warm. "We're glad you're here, too. You belong, Bakugou." For the first time, Bakugou didn't feel the urge to brush off the sentiment. He allowed himself to feel the full weight of their words, letting them settle in his heart as a quiet but powerful affirmation of everything they had built together. As they all headed off to their rooms, Bakugou felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. This was his family, his home, and he was finally ready to embrace it. Chapter 12. The early morning light streamed through Bakugou's window as he sat at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. It had become a habit of his to jot down goals, new challenges he wanted to tackle, but today, the process felt different. He wasn't driven by the usual pressure to prove himself, to outdo everyone else. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of determination, a desire to grow for his own sake. He thought back over the past months, everything he'd learned, the frustrations and small victories, the support he'd received from Aizawa and Yamada. He could see now that strength wasn't just about power or achievements, it was about balance, resilience, and trusting the people who stood beside him. With a steady hand, he began to write. 1. Develop a balanced training routine, one that pushes me but allows for rest. I want to get stronger, but I also want to be smart about it. 2. Improve teamwork skills, I'm learning that working with others doesn't make me weaker. I want to become a hero who can lead and support, one who others can trust. 3. Be open to learning, there's always something to learn from the people around me. I want to be receptive to that, even if it means stepping outside my comfort zone. He paused, reading over the goals, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Each one represented a part of him that had grown, a piece of his journey he was ready to embrace. It was no longer about being the best for everyone else's approval, it was about becoming the hero he wanted to be. Feeling a surge of pride, he picked up the paper and headed toward the kitchen, where he could already hear Yamada making coffee and Aizawa reading the morning news. "Hey, you too," Bakugou said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of excitement. "I set some new goals. Thought maybe I'd share them with you." Yamada looked up, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Well, let's hear 'em." Bakugou held out the paper, feeling a bit self-conscious, but knowing that he didn't have to hide anything from them. As Aizawa took the sheet and read it over, Bakugou watched their reactions, feeling a surge of warmth at the pride he saw in their eyes. "These are good goals," Aizawa said, his voice calm but filled with approval. "You put a lot of thought into them." Yamada nodded enthusiastically, his grin only widening. "Absolutely. You're not just aiming for strength, you're aiming for growth. That's real hero stuff, Bakugou." Bakugou felt his face warm at the praise, but he held his head high, allowing himself to feel the pride that came with this moment. "Yeah. I want to do it right this time. I want to be a hero people can rely on, not just someone trying to prove he's the best." Aizawa placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression softening. "And you're already on that path. These goals are just steps forward, and we'll be here with you every step of the way." Yamada clapped him on the back, his eyes shining with encouragement. "Couldn't be prouder, Bakugou. You're gonna crush these goals, one by one." Bakugou nodded, feeling the weight of their support settle around him like a protective shield. These goals weren't just about training or skill, they were about becoming someone he could be proud of, someone who didn't need validation from anyone but himself. As he looked between Aizawa and Yamada, he felt a deep gratitude, knowing that no matter where his journey took him, he would always have their support. This was just the beginning, and with their guidance, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. That evening, Bakugou found himself back in his room, surrounded by the quiet of the apartment. A strange feeling of calm settled over him, one he hadn't felt before, a feeling that things had finally come full circle. He reached for a small notebook tucked into the corner of his desk drawer, flipping through the old pages where he had once jotted down goals, motivations, and reminders that drove him forward. Most of those notes were intense, written with a sense of urgency and pressure he now recognized as fear, a fear of not being good enough, of letting people down, of never quite measuring up. Each word on the page was a glimpse into a past self, someone who had fought so hard to prove himself that he'd never allowed himself a moment of peace. With a sigh, Bakugou closed the notebook, holding it in his hands for a moment. It was a piece of him, a part of his journey, but he knew now that he didn't need it to define who he was or who he would become. As if on cue, there was a soft knock on the door, and Aizawa stepped into the room. He glanced at the notebook in Bakugou's hands, his expression calm and knowing. "Taking a trip down memory lane?" Bakugou gave a small nod, his voice quiet but steady. "Yeah, it's weird, looking back at all this. It feels like I'm saying goodbye to someone." Aizawa walked over, his gaze thoughtful as he sat down beside him. "That's part of growth, Bakugou. Sometimes, we have to let go of parts of ourselves that no longer serve us. It doesn't mean forgetting them, it means acknowledging what they taught us and moving forward with what we've learned." Bakugou nodded, feeling the truth of Aizawa's words settle over him. He thought back to the countless hours he'd spent pushing himself, driven by the belief that he had to be the best to be worthy, that his worth was tied to how strong, fast, or skilled he was. But now, with Aizawa's steady guidance and Yamada's unwavering support, he understood that his worth had always been there, independent of his achievements. "It's like I don't need this anymore," Bakugou said, holding up the notebook. "I used to think it was everything. That if I wasn't constantly improving, I'd be worthless." Aizawa placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his voice gentle. "You're worth so much more than a list of achievements, Bakugou. Strength doesn't come from a need to prove yourself, it comes from knowing who you are and being true to that, no matter what." Bakugou took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of freedom as he looked down at the notebook one last time. Without a second thought, he set it aside, leaving it on the desk. He didn't need those words anymore, they were a chapter that had shaped him, but they no longer defined him. "Guess it's time to let it go," he murmured, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Aizawa nodded, his expression filled with quiet pride. "That's a big step, Bakugou. It takes strength to let go of old habits, especially ones that have been a part of you for so long." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over Bakugou like a final release. This was closure, a goodbye to the doubts, fears, and pressures he'd carried for so long. He was finally ready to move forward, not just as a hero, but as a person who understood his own worth. As he looked over at Aizawa, a sense of gratitude filled him, an acknowledgement of everything they'd shared and learned together. "Thanks for sticking with me, Sensei. I wouldn't have gotten here without you and Yamada." Aizawa's gaze softened, a rare but genuine warmth in his eyes. "We're proud of you, Bakugou. You've come a long way, and you did it through your own strength, with your own choices. Remember, this journey is yours. And wherever it takes you, we'll be right here, supporting you." Bakugou nodded, his heart lighter than it had ever felt before. He knew that this wasn't the end, that there would still be challenges and setbacks, but he felt ready to face them with a newfound sense of resilience. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone but himself, and that knowledge gave him a quiet strength, one that came from within. As Aizawa left the room, Bakugou took one last glance at the notebook on his desk, feeling a sense of closure and peace. He was ready to leave that part of himself behind, to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that he was enough just as he was. The next evening, Aizawa and Yamada surprised Bakugou by inviting him to a small celebration. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple dinner with his favorite dishes, prepared with care and attention. As they gathered around the table, Bakugou felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he rarely allowed himself to indulge in but one that felt right tonight. Yamada beamed as he set a plate in front of him, his energy as bright as ever. "Tonight's about celebrating you, Bakugou. We've watched you grow so much, and you deserve a night to kick back and enjoy it." Bakugou looked at the table, taking in the effort they had put into making this evening special. It was a gesture that showed him just how much he was valued, how deeply they cared for him beyond his achievements or progress. Aizawa took his seat across from Bakugou, his expression softer than usual. "We're proud of you, not just for what you've accomplished, but for the person you're becoming. You've worked hard, and tonight is about honoring that." Bakugou felt a familiar blush rise to his cheeks, but he didn't look away. For once, he allowed himself to sit in the warmth of their words, to accept the praise and acknowledgement without feeling the need to brush it off. This was his family, and they had given him a place where he could simply be himself. As they began to eat, the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter, shared memories, and the occasional teasing remark from Yamada that made Bakugou roll his eyes with a smirk. He realized that he didn't have to try to fit in or measure up to any expectations here. With Aizawa and Yamada, he had found acceptance, a place where he belonged exactly as he was. At one point, Yamada raised his glass, his grin wide. "To Bakugou. For all he's achieved and all that's still ahead. We're lucky to have you with us." Aizawa lifted his glass as well, giving Bakugou a small nod. "Here's to a future filled with growth, trust, and the strength you've found within yourself." Bakugou lifted his own glass, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you, for everything. For sticking by me, for believing in me, even when I didn't. I'm grateful." They clinked glasses, and in that small, simple gesture, Bakugou felt the depth of the bond they had formed. This wasn't just a celebration of his progress, it was a celebration of the family they had become, a reminder that he would never have to face his challenges alone. As the evening continued, they shared more laughter, Yamada's stories growing more outrageous and Aizawa's rare smiles making the room feel even warmer. By the end of the night, Bakugou felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible, a quiet but powerful assurance that he had found his place, a home where he was valued and loved. When the night wound down, Bakugou lingered for a moment as Aizawa and Yamada began clearing the table. He looked at both of them, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "I know I don't say it much, but you're my family. I'm glad I have you." Yamada's eyes shone with emotion, and he wrapped an arm around Bakugou's shoulder in a quick but warm hug. "And we're glad we have you, too, Bakugou. Always." Aizawa gave him a nod, his expression filled with quiet pride. "You'll always have a place here. Remember that." Bakugou nodded, feeling the truth of their words settle in his heart. He didn't have to question it, didn't have to wonder if he was good enough. Here, with Aizawa and Yamada, he had found a family, a sense of belonging that went beyond words. As he headed off to his room that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever came next. He knew his journey wasn't over, that there would be more challenges and more growth ahead, but he also knew he would never have to face it alone. For the first time in his life, Bakugou felt complete, his heart full with the knowledge that he was loved and accepted, just as he was. And with that, he closed the door to his room, carrying with him the peace and joy of knowing he was truly home. This is the end of Healing at Home by the Angel Demon on AO3. If you have any suggestion, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to know when the next one is out. Have a good day, angels.